Hello, fellow Misfits. As our channel grows, we're constantly trying to improve the quality of stories we bring on. In tonight's episode of Strange, Weird, and Scary Horror Stories, we'll talk about frightening creature sightings that sound fake but are 100% real. If you didn't hit that like button, notification bell, and subscribe. And now, story time.
Hello, Den of Misfits. I encountered something strange on my job. I work on an oil rig. My job is to run an excavator and mix off the mud that comes out of the ground, and do stuff that needs big machine. Because of the locations of these rigs, I have to drive to pretty remote places in the wilderness of Canada. Anyhow, one of the light towers at the edge of the lease went out. I went over, and in the forest I could see these weird, like fireflies type of things, but like the size of a basketball. But they weren't bright, like they weren't lighting things up around them. Then I started feeling super uneasy. Then in between some trees, I could see this big ass silhouette of a person with red glowing eyes. I ran back into the machine just to see it walking away. When I was in it, I ended up telling the crew. I'm not the only one who's seen it. Like half of them have seen it and 2 of them have had it smile at them. WTF is this thing? Also, I'm so sorry for the punctuation. I was squirrel hunting on public hunting property in northwest Indiana, DNR, about an hour from my house. It is my habit to start my hunting early in the morning. I had never felt any pressure while hunting in this area or since the incident. So I thought nothing of hunting this day. It was fairly quiet except for the twittering of the occasional bird while I'd been there. It was after 11 a.m. when I decided to take a little break and have a snack from my pack. So I took a seat along the trail. As I sat there, a voice came into my thoughts that said, "Behind you. You preach to listen to your inner voice and trust it." I did. I turned around to look behind me. As soon as I got turned around, I saw an enormous being about 9 feet tall and 1,000 pounds with long flowing reddish-brown hair all over his body that resembled an orangutan in color. I only saw it for 1 or 2 seconds because that is how long it took for it to stride across the trail opening. I got the impression that it didn't know or didn't care that I was there since it didn't look my way. I was about 120 yards away, just sitting on the side of the trail. I suddenly wanted to get the hell out of there, realizing that I was no longer the apex predator in those woods. The .22 semi-auto rifle I had would have done nothing more than piss off the creature and offered no more protection than a sharp pointy stick. I head back to my car, looking over my shoulder the entire time, wondering if I was going to end up as a statistic. But I was not going to let this thing destroy my love for the woods. It took me a while, but I did make it back to those same woods. I now say at the very beginning of my hunts that I am only there to harvest a few squirrels and to enjoy the woods. I'm not there looking for them. I ask that they not scare me while I'm there. So far that has been working. Does this offer credence to mind speak? I don't know. Did the Sasquatch let me know it was there, wanting me to see it? I don't know, but that is what I am leaning toward. I was just an average hiker, out for a day hike in the national park. I had heard the legends of the Wendigo, but I never thought I would come face to face with one. It all happened so fast. One moment I was admiring the beauty of the woods, and the next, I was being tackled by a creature unlike any I had ever seen before. It was tall and thin, with matted fur and glowing eyes. It had elongated fingers that ended in sharp claws. Its mouth was wide and gaping, revealing razor-sharp teeth. The creature dragged me deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I struggled and fought, but it was no use. It was too strong. It pinned me to the ground and began to feast on my flesh. I remember thinking that this was it, this was the end. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the ranger station. Park Ranger Harold was sitting next to me. He was the one who had found my body and brought me back to civilization. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. I found you just in time. But I'm afraid the creature got away. I felt a surge of fear and anger. How could this have happened? How could a creature like that be roaming free in the national park? Harold must have sensed my emotions, because he quickly added, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it. I've already reported the incident to my supervisor, and he's sending out a team to track and capture the creature." But as it turns out, the supervisor had different plans. He didn't want to call the police because he feared that if the public found out about the creature, the national park would be closed down. So instead, he tasked Harold with finding and killing the creature himself. Harold was reluctant to accept the mission. But he knew he had no choice. He was the only one with experience tracking the creature, and he couldn't let anyone else get hurt. So, he went into the woods, armed with only a rifle and a determination to take down the monster. It was a cold and dark night when Harold finally caught sight of the creature. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. But the creature was fast and agile. It dodged the bullet and tackled Harold. The next morning, another ranger went to investigate and only found Harold's radio dispatcher. They searched for him, but they never found his body. It's been days since Harold went missing and the creature still roams free. I can't help but think that I was the one who brought this curse upon us all. If I had only stayed on the trail, if I had only ignored the legends, Harold would still be alive. But now it's too late. The creature is out there, and it's hungry. I can only hope that the next person who crosses its path is luckier than I was. When I was younger, I used to go to a place called Desolation Wilderness near Camino, California. It was the perfect place for camping and fishing, realizing that it had been a few years since my last trip. I talked to a friend of mine to go camping and fishing. We managed to talk another friend into coming with us, and then we were off. We arrived around 1 p.m. and decided to hike upstream from a place called Wright's Lake, and then when we found a good spot we would set up camp. After walking for a couple hours, a ranger found us hiking and told us that we actually weren't even technically in Desolation Wilderness yet and that we needed to keep hiking for a bit longer. I started tearing down the camp, but I guess the other two guys were not as enthusiastic about the trip as I was. They left for Placerville to find a hotel room. When they left, I hiked up a bit farther, but I started to worry about the amount of time I had to find a place and set up my camp before dark. As I hiked, I tried to remember the ranger's instructions, but I ended up getting lost. Finally, I found a granite cliff with a stream that had a beautiful pool of water and was right on the tree line. I thought it was perfect, so I set up camp and started fishing. When the sun had set and the sky was dark, I decided to go to sleep. Cozy in my sleeping bag, I started to drift off, but then I heard something growl outside my tent. I grabbed the .45 compact handgun from its case and looked down through the screen on the front of the tent. From where I was standing, I could only see a dark figure that looked around 4.5 feet tall standing near the trees. Thinking that it was a bear, I started yelling, hoping that I would scare it away. It didn't move. I then fired a shot at a dead tree nearby. That startled it and it ran back into the forest. But to my surprise, it didn't go very far. I climbed back into my tent. Then I heard crashing sounds. It was the sound of rocks falling off the cliff and hitting the pool below and the rocks around it. This was unnerving. I climbed out of my tent a few times, but I couldn't see anything even though the moon was bright and the white granite rocks reflected its paleness. Crashing rocks hit every few minutes until around 2 in the morning. Then it stopped. But I heard something rustling just outside my tent. I yelled at it and tried to scare it off. But instead of scaring it, I heard a very deep growling sound in return. At this point, I didn't want to wait until it got too close. So I got out of my tent and looked around. Nothing. I decided to shoot the tree again to see if the creature would react, then run back into the forest again just like the first time. But it stopped again. As I listened to the sounds of his moving, I realized that it was running on 2 feet. This was not a bear. I didn't want to go back into my tent. I grabbed my sleeping bag and moved over to the middle of the big slab of white granite nearby. I felt safer and knew the forest was further away from me. But I could still hear the noises of rocks crashing. I prayed the sun would come up soon. At about 4:30 in the morning, I was awoken from my light sleep. I looked back at the trees but didn't see anything. So I looked back over at my tent. There it was standing at the side of my tent. I panicked and picked up my gun and shot the side of the creature, but it didn't flinch. Then, with giant steps, it walked toward me. I shot at it. I wasn't sure if a .45 would even stop such a beast. But it was my only hope. After the second shot rang out, it was off into the trees. Shaking like a leaf, I sat down clutching my gun. I waited for hours until the lights started to appear in the sky. I broke camp and headed back down to Wright's Lake. That was the last time I saw the creature. That was also the last time I went to the Desolation wilderness, and I will never go back. I live in apartments with a cemetery right behind them, so it's not uncommon to have experiences like this. However, I'm not sure if this is a spirit or a cryptid or if these experiences are connected. A few nights ago, me and my friend were walking back from the store 10:30 p.m. We both heard a little girl screaming stuff such as "Mommy help" and saw a man chasing something into the woods. We called the police, but they didn't help, just looked around a bit and told us to call back if we hear or see anything. Me and my friend decided to search ourselves as we kept hearing the cries in the woods. After a while we went to the spot we were when we first heard it. We heard it again coming from the trails. We looked, stupid idea I know, and saw what looked like a tall skinny person crouched down. Its skin was gray and looked like it was stretched across the bones. It looked up, but I couldn't see much because our lights weren't bright enough. I heard a cracking sound and smelled the clay you can find by digging. Once I heard the noise, the rain got really heavy and the wind almost knocked me over. I'm on the heavier side, so that wouldn't be easy. Ever since seeing it, we have both been really tired, almost like the energy was suddenly sucked out of us. We both felt sick and ran, but earlier at around 6 p.m. it gets dark at 5 p.m. here. I was walking back from the same store. As I was walking past the spot we saw it, I heard my best friend. He lives 2 hours away, so I was kind of shocked at first. He was yelling for me to wait for him. I saw him standing there, but it wasn't exactly him. He has glasses, but this thing didn't. It was thinner and shorter than him, also had brown eyes when his are grayish blue. The friend I was walking with mentioned meeting me before I actually met him. He told me I walked up to him and told him he shouldn't be walking around by himself because of creeps in the apartments. He gave me a description of it and it looked like me expected. Had an ankle monitor on, had scars I don't have but didn't have the ones I do, made him stay on the left side of it, and that it was trying to get him to follow it to a clearing behind the basketball court, which I don't go to because I had a traumatic experience there. He also mentioned it has asked for the boy who caused that traumatic experience and got angry when he told it he didn't know where the boy was. The boy who caused it hasn't lived in the apartment since 2017. This incident occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. I started my career as a Memphis police officer a few years previously in the 1980s. I was on a special assignment at the time. It was 2 a.m. and it was a clear summer night but quite humid. I was in my personal vehicle with the top down and the radio playing. I was still in my uniform, including my bulletproof vest and a gun belt with all the regular equipment attached to it. I was heading south on Covington Pike at a good rate of speed and was the only one on the road. This part of the road connects the Raleigh-Bartlett area to the Berkeley area. The road is slightly elevated as the surrounding area is low, and running through it is the Wolf River, which is a few miles from here and connects to the Mississippi River. This area is commonly referred to by the locals as the Wolf River Bottoms these days. As I was driving, in my peripheral vision over to my right, just outside my headlight beams, I noticed something was moving fast directly toward the front of my car. I immediately slammed on the brakes, thinking that a deer was running across the road. But I couldn't have been more wrong. It came to a screeching halt right in the middle of the road right in front of my headlights, not more than 7 feet from my bumper. As we both froze in place staring at each other for several seconds. It appeared to be 3 to 4 feet tall but was also crouched. It could have been closer to 5 if it stood straight up, but I got the impression that its current body posture was its normal way of standing. It had a large head, at least compared to its skinny slender body. It appeared to be dark gray and greenish in color, similar to the color of an alligator, but the appearance of its skin looked like a similar texture to a human's. It had dark large oval eyes on each side of the upper part of its face running slanted from the top portion of its head to about the midsection of its head. It was kind of pointing inward to where you would expect a nose to be. However, from what I could tell, there was no distinct nose. At least none like a human. Below the eyes was a very thin dark almost black line which I assumed was its mouth. It ran from about the same location a human's mouth would be, however, the line ran straight across the lower face in front and then turned upward and slightly back on the head. It had no ears that could see. Its body and chest area were rounded like a human but vastly smaller, almost like a child's. Its arms appeared to be longer and somewhat disproportionate to its body, and they were skinny and had an insect-type look to them. I could make out hands, but they were also completely folded at the wrist joint. The legs were long because, even with this thing's shortness, I could make out the top of them even with it so close to the bumper which was obscuring the bottom half somewhat. They were like the arms, thin and insect-like, but appeared to be jointed. I did notice its chest area moving slightly like it was breathing, but it seemed slow and steady. I never noticed anything like genitalia. There was no hair any place that I could see, and I'm not even sure if it was wearing any type of clothing. If it was, it would have had to be skin tight. I never noticed a tail at any point. My adrenaline was pumping and it was only a brief period of observation. It again took off like a shot and it was out of my headlights. I could still make out its outline in the darkness and it was moving like a sprinter. It leapt over the guardrail onto the other side of the road and down the embankment. I will admit that this was not the only bizarre incident that I had during my career, but it definitely was the strangest. I never told anyone on the force about the encounter. In fact, I only mentioned it to a close friend during these many years. I can only identify it as a lizard man or an unknown humanoid. I would have never believed it unless I actually witnessed it. My father and I had just left the La Burbuja grocery store and were crossing 32nd to go toward my car when we heard what sounded like a baby crying out. We thought it was maybe one of the neighbor's babies, but then my father said "Mira mija," and was pointing toward the house across the street. I looked and saw a thin black figure perched on the brick fence post and looking directly at us. This thing was dark black. It actually looked like it was absorbing the light around it. It was very easy to make out the body, the wings, and the long pointed tail that it swished around much like a cat does when it is interested in something. The eyes were the most striking feature as they were glowing bright red and were locked directly on my father and me. I was frozen in fear, and the only thing going through my mind was how to defend my elderly father if this thing decided to attack us. I could care less about myself, but my father is 70 years old and not able to move or defend himself if he was attacked. I could hear my father praying and asking La Virgen de Guadalupe for protection and to send this thing away. I managed to tell my father that we needed to get into the car as quickly as possible so we could be safe. I pressed the button to the remote and the horn chirped as the alarm was deactivated and the doors unlocked. At the sound of the horn chirping, this thing opened its wings and stood up on the fence post and chirped back at us. It took off and hovered for a few seconds, its wings flapping and making a light whoosh sound. My father and I dove into the relative safety of the car as this thing flew away and was gone from our sight. This thing was maybe 3 to 4 feet tall and thin, but its wings were large and maybe 10 feet when spread apart. They looked a lot like bat wings. No feathers were visible as it was jet black. We drove straight home and my father told my mother and my sister about our encounter with this thing and what had happened. My mother said it was probably a bruja disguised as a lechusa and that we were lucky we were not attacked. Either way, she refused to let anyone out of the house for the rest of the night. That sound brought one of my brothers into the house to alert the rest of the family to come hear this. We went outside and stood in the driveway, and heard the most frightening guttural roar you can imagine. This accompanied the pounding on the wood object. This lasted several minutes. The evening was clear, warm, and without wind. I do not remember a moon. Neither brother could explain what was happening, and I recall being scared out of my wits. When the sound subsided, the family returned inside. The incident was not discussed in front of me again. As a child, I was privileged to live in this remote, beautiful area and be allowed to run free. Sometime later, a boyfriend and I observed what we were told must have been a bear in a thicket of alder trees near the house. The feces found there later contained crawdad shells and berry seeds, with a horrible odor. But the creature we saw was not a bear. The hard, dry ground showed no tracks. Our fathers were loggers and we were well versed in the local wildlife. While this all happened a very long time ago, I still get cold chills remembering those sounds. Years later, my fiancé and I were driving north on Oregon Highway 101 near Cape Perpetua, north of Florence, Oregon. The highway was narrow, two-lane, with the Pacific Ocean on the west and steep rock cliffs on the east. I was watching the moon over the ocean, turned sidewise, facing the ocean. A very large black creature rose from a cleft in the cliff and towered over the little car we were in. My fiancé yelled, "What the hell was that?" I only caught a glimpse of the thing through my peripheral vision, but it was huge and very fast. I suppose we surprised it as much as it surprised us. It terrified me. My fiancé searched for a place to turn around as he wanted to go back, and I refused to let him. We were armed with what suddenly seemed to be a very small weapon, considering the size of the creature. When we returned home, my fiancé told his father about the encounter. His father told us of the rancher at the foot of the Capes, also on Highway 101, who had been riding to check on his cattle when he heard a cow bellowing in agony. His horse became nervous, but he forced it on and found a very large hairy animal chewing on the live cow. He carried a 30.06 rifle and shot the creature. It stood up and ran off on two legs. He followed until he lost the trail of blood in the rocky terrain. This is the first time I have ever heard of someone shooting and wounding one of these creatures. It is also the first time I've heard of this creature eating the meat of any animal. Our encounter was in the late evening with clear skies and a full moon. My fiancé saw the creature in the headlights and had a great view of it. He knew it was not a bear and didn't think it was a human in a fursuit. Facial features did not have a snout and the arms were too long for a bear's front legs. I was too terrified to grasp any features. I have never felt fear like that before or since. This national park is located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To get to the island you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island, drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed on Rock Island. Even though the island is relatively small at about 975 acres, it has had an interesting history. In the early 1600s it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other, and did have a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part they lived peacefully together on the island. By the 1640s the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after the Potawatomi had left the island, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to talk to one of these new settlers, or even find where they were living. It was around this time that strange things started to happen in the village. Several animals. It's not mentioned what they were. Maybe it was pigs or chickens kept by the settlers were found slaughtered in the village and seemed to have been used to make markings in blood on some of the buildings in the village. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burned down. The villagers felt that these things must have been done by these new people on the island, and they intended to find them. But after a thorough search of the island, including the wooded inland area, they never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the other settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported back that the material of which the lighthouse and dwelling are made are of the best quality, and that the work is done in a substantive and workmanlike manner. David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light on December 19, 1837. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of construction of the lighthouse, David Corbin started to complain that plaster started to fall off the building and some sort of liquid would ooze through cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was completely alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and some have said when visiting him that he would stare at a certain wall and sometimes spoke vaguely of the other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was acting strange. The official report says that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a wife to live with him at the lighthouse. However, some think that the inspector was startled by Corbin's mental state caused by years of solitude and thought it would be best that he spent some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported the surprisingly quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends that had visited the new keeper say that he would talk of seeing strange things in the house at night, but he wouldn't elaborate on what he had seen. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper, or a family with them at the lighthouse. No strange occurrences were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw 2 men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote a terrible storm came up shortly after their departure and they never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3, 1876, Betts wrote the 2 men who were lost last January have been seen several times. Once from Caney Lighthouse and once from Jacksonport. The men were apparently frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account they were still adrift. There is not much hope that they will be found and buried. By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thordarson, purchased all of the island except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Thordarson is responsible for the unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall that has a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed on the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store Thordarson's immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it's rumored that he possessed some very rare books on the occult in his collection. Thordarson died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. I couldn't find any writings from Thordarson, however, that mentioned him experiencing anything strange on the island. After his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in his book collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they had to purchase it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history is hard to find on the internet, But there are a couple binders in the Great Hall that has a lot of this documented. Thordarson's personal papers are housed in the archives section of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. All of this history I gave is just to provide a little context for experiences I have had, directly or indirectly, on Rock Island. In August of 2021 I took my first, and last, trip to Rock Island. After taking 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at about 2 p.m. I had booked the remote campsite E, which is a backpacking site that is a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking out to the site to enjoy the scenery and took a couple breaks just due to how heavy my pack was. I was definitely packed more for camping than hiking. I got to my site, set up my tent, got everything situated, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so I could start a fire. On my third trip back from the beach, before I got back to my site, I heard a single high-pitched squeal noise coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stopped in my tracks and waited for a good 30 seconds waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began working on getting a fire started. The remote camping sites on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out. Sites C, D, and D are grouped together, but there's probably 100 yards between each site. There's not a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the 3 sites that there's an obvious path. As I was setting some sticks up in my fire ring, something caught my eye and I looked up. Fairly far away, it looked like it might have been at site D or a little further, was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it's not even really a trail they were on. Then my mind just went to there must be something wrong and this person needs help. They got a little closer and it looked like maybe it was a woman in loose gray clothes, maybe in a hoodie. It was still far enough away that I couldn't really make out any details. I quickly stood up from the crouching position I was in, and just as I did I heard that high-pitched squeal noise again. It was behind me, and it was much closer this time. This startled me quite a bit, so I turned around to look behind me. I scanned the trees for a couple seconds, but didn't see or hear anything. I turned back around because I knew the running person must be getting close, but now they were gone. Again I stood there and scanned the trees, but did not see them anywhere. I was so confused I was kind of frozen for a few seconds. It was all very strange, but I was able to reason it out in my head that it was just a fellow camper from site C or D that was maybe running to the pit toilet that was a couple 100 yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it, but it was really just bothering me. I did not like whatever that squeal noise was, and I just felt strange. With some effort I decided to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple adult beverages, then decided to take a little walk. I hadn't seen sites C or D yet, so I thought I would check those out and see if I did have some neighbors camping nearby. Site D was empty. I did see the path that led from that site to the main trail and pit toilet, so that made me feel a little less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was maybe someone from site C that took a strange way to get to the main trail by going through site D. It didn't make a ton of sense because I probably still should have seen them, but it made me feel better. I continued on to site C and saw there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, but I just thought I would go over with the excuse that I would introduce myself as a camping neighbor from site E, and see if anyone looked like they might have been the person running earlier. I came up on the site and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither of them looked like they would have been the person I saw running. I introduced myself, and they introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s, they were very nice, and both seemed to be pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner, or the squealing noises because I thought it might be weird. I wished them a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark and it started as a perfect night. The sky was clear and I was just staring up and looking at millions of stars. I felt better about everything from earlier and felt stupid about the whole thing and decided to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. At around 2:30 a.m. I woke up by a huge boom of thunder. It started downpouring. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but I do not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through and I was starting to worry. The wind was whipping at my tent and the ground was shaking from the thunder and lightning. I did not feel good about being out there in a tent and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it became just a light steady drizzle. I was just starting to fall back asleep when I heard the squeal noise again. I opened my eyes up wide in the dark and just laid there silent. There was another louder squeal noise and it was pretty close. I knew there are no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There are deer and porcupines, but nothing like bear or wolves. Knowing that still didn't make me feel better though. There was just something about that squeal that I didn't like. I say squeal because that's the best I can describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. I honestly don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured, or angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent and started to hear footsteps outside my tent. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little buried in the sound of rain, but it definitely sounded like a somewhat large animal or human walking around. I sat up in my tent and took a knife I had out just to feel better. In my head I just kept saying, it's just an animal. It's fine. There's nothing in these woods that can hurt you. I listened as the footsteps started moving away from my tent. I just sat there being still, holding my knife for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else. I started thinking to myself, it's fine. It was just an animal. You're being stupid, and you need to get some sleep. I was just about to lay back down when there was a very loud squeal and it was right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped and a shiver went down my spine. My heart was beating so hard my entire body was pulsing, and I felt it in my ears. It took everything in me, but I forced out a get out of here. Not shouting, but as stern and mean sounding as I could at that moment. I didn't hear any more squeals or footsteps that night, but I also didn't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I laid down. Eventually the rain stopped and I kept laying there until the sun came up. All that time reassuring myself that I was being stupid. It was just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided I had to get out of my tent to relieve myself. As soon as I stepped outside my tent, I saw that my picnic table had been turned over and was upside down. When I saw this, I surprisingly calmly thought, okay, this is enough, I'm leaving the island today. I checked my surroundings and nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned with myself that the wind had blown the table over during the storm. It still seemed a little strange because the table was pretty heavy and I felt like I would have heard the table flipping over, but that might have made sense. I made some cold instant coffee, had a bite to eat, started to feel better about the whole thing, then decided to go for a hike. I admit, I get easily scared when I'm camping by myself in the woods. Maybe that's natural. After I had some coffee and food, and the sun came out, I realized that nothing I heard or saw was really anything that couldn't be explained. Other than not getting a good night's sleep, I was having a pretty good time. The reason I came to the island in the first place was to hike the 7-mile Thordarson's Loop trail that has a lot of interesting things to see, and I was excited to start the hike. I packed a few things in my backpack and started off. Fairly close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked, or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked like someone had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail was a cemetery where 2 sisters and a few others are buried. It's believed there are still more buried here in unmarked graves. These likely are some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. There is one by the beach and that's where Chester Thordarson is buried. There's one on the eastern part of the island where the 2 sisters are buried. And there's one on the northern part of the island where the original lighthouse keeper David E. Corbin is buried. There is also at least one Potawatomi burial area on the island, but no one knows exactly where that is. I kept walking on the trail until I came to a nice scenic overlook area with a bench where I sat down and drank some water. I started to hear some talking on the trail ahead of me, but I couldn't see anyone yet. There was a bend in the trail and the trees were thick, so I sat on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. The voices were coming closer and I could tell that they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place what language it might have been. Both voices were very, very deep and guttural. Then back deep in the woods I hear a loud and quick you. Immediately both the voices I was listening to responded with their own ooh. I kind of smiled because it sounded like these two heard whatever it was in the woods and they were trying to be funny and mock it by responding. I got off the bench, put my backpack back on and started walking in the direction further down the trail where the voices were coming from. But I never did find these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin is buried. I took a self-guided tour of the Potawatomi Lighthouse. I passed the wooden gate that apparently used to be part of a larger structure. I walked by the Great Hall and Dock area from where I arrived on the island. Visited some of the other structures on the island. Came across the cemetery where Chester Thordarson is buried. Then finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with a lot to see and wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to campsite C to ask the couple I spoke with the night before how they did with the storm during the night, but they had packed up and left. I was disappointed because I also really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises during the night. The rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar and some drinks. As soon as it got dark I was ready for bed since I had so little sleep the night before. I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours when I woke up suddenly and was immediately fully alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and this part is a little hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It felt like there was something in the tent with me, and I could feel that it was angry, seething with anger, rageful even, and I could feel its hatred for me. It felt like something very bad was about to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat, and it got stronger and stronger to the point where I wanted to throw up, but couldn't because I was frozen. I had never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forward at nothing, just frozen, and the weird thing is I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. It was like my brain telling me that whatever is about to happen, even if it's death, will at least be relief. Then I passed out. At least I have to assume I passed out. That's all I remember until I woke up at about 8 a.m. that morning. When I woke up I was laying outside of my sleeping bag, on top of it, and my legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back with my left leg straight out, and my right leg was bent so that my foot was up against my left knee. My heart started pounding, but I kept thinking to myself it was a dream. I'm leaving right now. It was a dream. I'm leaving right now. I packed up everything very quickly and started back toward the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until about 10:30 a.m., I had to kill a little time around the Great Hall and Dock area. I wanted to get off that island so bad, but I did feel a little better just being out of the woods and I could see other people. I sat down on a bench a little to the east of the dock and lit a cigar just to give me something to do while trying not to think about the night before. I was sitting a few minutes and scanning out over the water when I was startled by someone behind me saying hi. I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you smoking and just came over to ask if you had a lighter. I felt like an idiot and told him that's fine. I just didn't sleep well last night and was kind of zoned out, and I handed him my lighter. He thanked me, lit a cigarette, then handed the lighter back to me. We started talking about the usual things you might talk about. He said he was from the Madison area. We talked about the storms we've been having. He seemed to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy, and talked about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice normal conversation and kind of took my mind off the night I just had for a little bit. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. Then, naturally, he asked me what site I had been staying at. I told him I was staying at Site E the last 2 nights, and he said he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said he had booked Site D the last 2 nights. I was surprised by this because no tent or anything was at Site D the 2 times I walked past the site. I told him this and he said he comes to the island a few times a year and you have to book a site, but he actually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps and he told me most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me that he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods where he finds a place to camp. He said that one time he found the ruins of a small log house in those woods and he's going to try and find it again and camp inside of it. At this point I started to change my opinion about this guy and wanted to change the subject, but then he asked me if I had heard the screeches in the woods. I took a second to reply and knew he was talking about the squealing I had heard. I told him I had, and asked him if he knew what it was. This time he took a second to reply and I saw his face change. He looked as if he was thinking if he should tell me something. Like a secret. With no expression at all on his face he said matter-of-factly, a demon lives on this island. Under any other circumstance I would have laughed this off, but not after what I experienced the night before. He looked at me and must have seen the anxiety and fear I was feeling. He surprised me by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night. I told him I hadn't seen anything and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt like he could tell I had experienced something. At this point I was ready for the conversation to be over. Then he told me he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now his face and mood kind of changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really did not want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to ask it. So I asked him what he saw in the cemetery, but my voice was shaky. Then I could tell he had changed his mind about telling me. He actually looked at me with empathy and told me that what he saw was hard to explain, but if I was afraid of the screeching noises he didn't think I should go near the cemetery. I didn't say anything right away, but he said 4 words without any context. Keepers of the flame. I looked at my cigar and the ash was long. I put it out, and told him I was going to wait by the dock for the boat. He nodded and I started to walk away. After a few steps he said hey, and I turned around to look at him. He just said don't come back here. I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if that was a warning, or a friendly suggestion, but I took it to heart. I was definitely not coming back to Rock Island. When I got home I looked up Keepers of the Flame as it pertained to Rock Island. I found 3 things that he could have been referring to. The name of the Native Americans that lived on the island, the Potawatomi, could be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were sometimes referred to as the Keepers of the Flame. Then there was also a 19th century cult that was said to visit the island from time to time that called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking the trails and exploring Chester Thordarson's buildings. My humble suggestion is this. Do not go to Rock Island. I have debated posting this because I don't know if it's classified as paranormal or just a weird event. This event happened around November 2022 and it was 8 p.m. I was by myself at the entrance area of the school. My dad and I go to evening/night school. I'm studying computer science, and my dad studies mechanical engineering. At that time I had the 3 first periods free because my teacher was sick and I was hanging out at my dad's class when I saw that the break was coming up after it. I had class and because of the distance I decided to cross the campus so I won't be late to class. The break was 10 minutes and it took 8 minutes to cross the campus at a normal pace, but due to my osteoarthritis sometimes my legs are heavy and my walking is slow. That day was a day that my legs were heavy and my osteoarthritis was flaring up and my pace was very slow. So, at 8 p.m. I was waiting for the bell to ring signaling the first break, and I was sipping my hot chocolate from my thermos after having gone to the school cafeteria to get some ice cubes to put in because it was too hot. I was about to start scrolling through my phone since I was by myself and I felt very on edge. I was coming down from a week-long anxiety attack. I'm thinking it was because of that I felt on edge. To my left, there's this entrance door that leads to the second school on campus, my old high school, and where I was about a few minutes ago since my dad's class is located in the basement of that building. Outside that building, there is a lamp post and I turned to see it. A second after my eyes set on it I noticed it was flickering. I thought nothing of it, thinking that it must be bugs flying around it or because of what is happening with the energy crisis our town is lowering the voltages causing that flickering as they did during COVID-19 lockdowns. Hence why I don't think it's paranormal, but what makes me post this here is how the flickering and the black that appeared in between it started becoming bigger and bigger every time. 3 times flickered and the third time the black spot was very big. Then there was an oomph sound from everywhere and nowhere at the same time before almost the entire campus was dived into darkness. Everything was dark except the classes. I could see the lights from the space under the door. The darkness lasted for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I jumped up and walked as fast as my legs would allow to the cafeteria to ask the lady behind the counter and the cleaner that was with her chatting if they were okay. To get to them from where I was it would take me a minute tops, but when I entered the cafeteria the lights came back on and when I asked they said there was no power outage. Confused I walked back to the bench I was sitting at and everything was normal. The bell went off and a break ensued. But in the minutes of darkness, it was completely silent and I felt dread and on edge, even a bit of fear. I'm used to power outages from living on an island growing up that had many times run out of power throughout the winter, so I always carry a flashlight with me and I make sure my phones always have flashlights. What was that darkness? Why was I the only one to live through it? I asked my dad and he said there was no power outage. Same answers from fellow classmates and my mom when I asked them. Any theories? Hey all, I have worked overnight at a nursing home for about 3 years now. During my time here we've probably had 60 plus people pass. I've noticed that sometimes when certain strong-willed people pass, there is some sort of electrical disturbance that happens. I used to think it was just a coincidence, but it has happened like 8 plus times since I've been working overnight. It can last up to 2 weeks after someone passes. Some examples. One lady passed at around 9 p.m. There is a door that leads outside 2 doors down from her room. The door is always locked and requires a number combo to unlock. The door's silent alarm tripped at 11:30 p.m. The door alarms only go off if someone opens it. After 10 it's just overnight crew and we stick together. We checked it out and there was no one there. It happened 2 more times a few days apart. A man passed near the front of the building. The silent alarm for the front door went off every night at around 2 a.m. It happened for about a week and then it stopped. One lady passed at 12. We were watching TV and all of a sudden it felt like a shock wave passed through the building. The lights in the TV area flickered off and on for a quick second. The TV turned off and turned back on. I joked that maybe that lady had passed. We checked on her and she had just passed. Her body was still warm. Her neighbor's TV had also turned on and was on a static channel. Each room has a button on the wall that sends an alarm to the caregivers. We have had those go off multiple times in rooms where people have recently passed. Always freaks us out when it happens. To this day I haven't seen anything, but too many electrical disturbances happen close to someone's passing for it to be a coincidence. Has anyone else experienced any stuff like this? I've always wondered what exactly it was that I saw. Some may call it ball lightning, but I think that classification really takes away from the phenomenon at hand. This thing knew what it was doing. One late summer night, I think this was back in 2001. My friend was staying the night at my house and we went out for a walk. He was 14 and I was 16. At the time, I lived on the family farm in rural southern Maryland. There was a large, relatively circular path that circumscribed the westernmost parcel of land that connected the 4 homes on the property. Most of the path was laden with large gravel rocks, but the northern quadrant of this path was an old paved driveway that ran from my mobile home, past the barn, and to the rural country road that marked the western edge of the farm. The path from my home to the road was about 500 feet, I'm guessing. I'm sure that's all very confusing, but I'm just trying to paint a picture. I'll post a link to some aerial photos below to illustrate what I'm describing. Anyway, back then, I'd usually walk our beagles around the farm at night, at my mother's request, so I had no fears of wandering around at night. When my friend came over, it was fun to break up our Red Faction kill stakes with strolls around the farm. It was very dark out in the country, and with all of the open space the night sky was a canopy of stars. Couple that with the warm summer air, and nighttime excursions were irresistible. Anyway, we headed out. My terrier, Mitzi, followed along with us. She was always at my heels and didn't need a leash like the beagles did. My friend and I started walking along the paved driveway and had intended to complete the circular path in a counterclockwise direction. We made it nearly to the road, just passing my great-uncle's. He owned the farm, house on our right, with my great-aunt's house to our left. The path shot off to the left along my aunt's dirt driveway and would have connected to the gravel path further along, but something caught my eye. Another one of my great-aunts lived across the country road, directly adjacent from my uncle's house. The photos will help, but her house wasn't on farm property, though there was an open field on her side of the road. Behind her house was a wall of trees, and the deep woods beyond. The woods were everywhere out there, but my farm was mostly open land. Back too, something caught my eye. What I saw was a light coming out from the woods behind my aunt's house. The road was quiet, everything was quiet. I watched this light come closer, and I don't know why the first thing I thought it could be was a white rabbit, but I was trying to make sense of something that was about to get stranger. As the light crossed the road and approached closer, I could see that it was a floating ball of light, about the size of a basketball, floating about 3 feet off the ground. I'm not sure when I nudged my friend to get his attention, but we were both watching as the light avoided and maneuvered around the few tall pine trees my uncle had in his front yard. One thing I noticed about the light was that it was bright and white, but it didn't seem to cast any light on its surroundings. I don't remember if one of us moved or said something, but the light noticed us and stopped. It sat still for a few seconds, and so did we. We just watched it, and we were about 30 feet from it. Eventually, my dog noticed it too, as she was sniffing around somewhere else up until then. She started yapping and ran right at the sphere of light. At that point, the light sped off, very fast, back in the direction it had come from, right back into the woods with my dog trailing behind. Mitzi was a fast dog, but she couldn't keep up. We watched her follow it into the woods, though. My friend and I just looked at each other, probably said a few expletives, and ran back to my house and into my room. My dog lost her quarry, as she was back on our heels by the time we reached my yard. The experience was more bewildering than scary, but the adrenaline rush of seeing something like that had us wired, and I kinda wanted to be scared, so we were just staring out my window, which faced the end of the driveway, for the rest of the night. I'm still not sure what it was, but that ball of light exhibited an intelligence, an active awareness of its surroundings, and perhaps fear, which prompted it to flee. I went to a friend's house in the Bridgeport area of Harrison County, West Virginia to sight in my new rifle. He began to tell me a story of a strange animal that was killed on this farm by the man who owned it before his death. The farmer was a coon hunter and went out almost every night. One night the farmer's dogs got on a scent and took off. They ran for about an hour and stopped at the base of a tree as usual. The farmer made his way up the hill to the tree to shoot the coon the dogs had cornered. There was nothing there though. Thinking this was very strange, he started to look around when he noticed a tree with its limbs shaking. Something was jumping from tree to keep from being seen. The farmer, finding this very strange, went and told my friend what had happened and dismissed it altogether. About a week later, the supposed creature did the same trick. This made the old man suspicious because his dogs were very well trained and had never let him down before. This happened for about a month, when one night the dogs treed an animal and the farmer got there quickly and shot it. To his surprise, it was no coon. It had long grayish, brown hair and was about 5 feet tall. Its hands were human-like and its feet were more hand-like than anything. I told my friend he was crazy, so he decided to prove it to me. He told me the old man kept the animal but did not have it mounted cause he was afraid he had done something wrong. My friend took me to the old barn and there it was. The old man had nailed its carcass to the wall. I was shocked. It was built a lot like a human and had hair 6 or 7 inches long on it. It had very large sharp teeth and resembled some kind of ape-looking creature. I told my friend I wouldn't say anything about it, but I feel that it is my duty to report this. If anyone has any idea what this animal could be, please let me know. As a young police officer named Harry, I received a call from a park ranger in Ozark National Park. There had been a murder of a hiker and they suspected something paranormal, but they weren't sure. Being an avid believer in the unknown, I was immediately intrigued and said I would check it out. Once I arrived at the park, the ranger led me to the hiker's corpse. Upon analyzing the body, I concluded that it had been attacked by a bear. But the ranger shook his head, telling me that bears don't leave bodies behind, they eat them. He continued, saying that this was the work of some serious cryptid, possibly a loup-garou. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A werewolf in Ozark National Park? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right there in front of me. The ranger told me that the full moon was that night and that I should investigate then. As night fell and the full moon rose high in the sky, I made my way back to the crime scene, alone. As I approached the corpse, I watched in horror as it began to transform before my eyes. The body contorted and twisted, taking on the shape of a monstrous werewolf. And with a roar, it lunged towards me before running off into the woods. I was in shock, unable to move or even think. How could this be possible? I had always been skeptical of the supernatural, but now I had witnessed it firsthand. I knew that no one would believe me, and that my career as a police officer would be over if I reported it. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, unable to shake the memory of that night. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. And eventually, I was committed to a mental asylum, deemed too unstable to continue my duties as a police officer. But even in the asylum, I couldn't escape the memory of that night in Ozark National Park. I knew that the werewolf was still out there, roaming the woods, and that it would always be a part of me. I could only hope that one day, someone would believe my story and put an end to the monster that had destroyed my life. As a cop, my experience with the supernatural was very limited to a few traumatizing encounters with demons that left me with a deep fear for life. However, this particular account is told by a friend of mine who is a fellow officer in a small town in Minnesota. And this was back when he was a rookie on patrol. One night, he told me about an incident where they were dispatched to a call at a local residence. He said that upon arrival, his sergeant spotted somebody running through the backyard of the house. It wasn't until they got closer did they see a black figure dashing into a nearby grove of trees. They radioed dispatch for backup, cautiously approaching the grove with guns drawn, ready to shoot on sight as assuming it was a suspect trying to escape. As they got closer, a faint moaning sound broke the silence, which caused him and my partner to freeze in their tracks. Where they heard a thud followed by a loud crack of a branch breaking. He looked back at his partner, who simply shrugged as my friend slowly pushed forth the trees. He saw an apparition that gave him goosebumps even though it wasn't cold outside. A stout humanoid creature began to emerge from behind a tree not more than 20 feet away, quickly making its way towards a clearing with a full moon, causing them to see a silhouette of it against the moonlight. He said that what he saw was this hulking black figure with chalk white skin and a bald head with no ears or nose or really much features at all, but could sense a deep malice emanating from this thing. All my friend could think about was his family as he slowly reached for his firearm until something slammed into him, knocking him over onto the ground. What grabbed hold of him wasn't human. It had a hand around his neck which seemed gnarled and leathery, except its fingers were 3 times longer. The only way he described these demon hands gripping around his neck is that it felt like being a victim of a boa constrictor, and it would only tighten its grip to the point where you would die from lack of oxygen. He also explained that he could see a mouth full of razor teeth opening up as if ready to bite his head off, but thank God for a police siren that caused this thing to release him and vanish. And my friend explained that what happened next was even more bizarre than the attack itself. One car showed up while the nether approached from a different direction with her lights turned on, shining directly into where this figure ran and vanished. After a brief investigation and questioning, they declared it a false alarm. My friend said that a couple of months after this encounter, the local sheriff passed away due to a sudden heart attack despite being a very healthy man in the prime of his life. He told me that he later found out years later that a strange police officer was picked up back then who claimed he saw a monster dressed in a police uniform before committing self-harm shortly after his arrest under mysterious circumstances. Now, when he made the claim of monster, I'm assuming he meant as an individual, not an actual monster. He said this happened at a time where strange people. My shift involved the night shift. I got a call to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. I wasn't too worried about it. I thought I'd be stuck dealing with a vagrant or a squatter. But as I walked up to the door, I realized something was off. As I approached the porch, I felt an overwhelming sense from inside that I shouldn't go any further. But even though my mind was screaming at me to turn back, I couldn't help myself. There's nothing more dangerous than that thin line we all have to cross, especially in our field of work as officers. I have every right to be here, I told myself, reaching for the handle. But just as I was about to grab it, I heard a noise coming from within. I drew my gun, held with both hands, and forced myself inside. It didn't take long for me to realize that nobody else was in here. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see or find, but clearly this place had been vacant for a while. As soon as I had thoroughly checked everything out, I started back towards my squad car. However, I heard another sound behind me. I turned around and I saw it. It was human, I think, but its eyes were like black pits that went on forever. I couldn't even tell where I was looking when I looked into him. And then the smell hit me. An awful stench like I had never experienced before. Rotting meat left to fester in the sun for days and sulfur. I can still smell it sometimes, even though I haven't seen or heard of what it was since. I know this is a very short story, but I'm not really sure what I saw that night. But I know one thing for certain, whatever that being was, God help us all if I ever have to meet it again. I've been working as a police officer in Detroit for a little more than a decade now. I've learned that ghosts are not the scariest thing you'll find out there. Living people are far worse. However, one of my first scary experiences did involve something paranormal. It still roams around my mind. I was still a rookie back then, going out for my first night patrols. I was nervous but also excited to get the chance to finally take matters into my own hands to make the country a safer place and play my part. Yes, I was the classic naive kid with big dreams. I believed that becoming a cop was the closest thing to a superhero. I know better now. So, anyway, I was sitting there next to my partner in the car, driving around the neighborhood patrolling. It was starting to get very late, around 11:35 p.m. We had seen nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary, so we're getting kind of bored. We parked in sort of a desolate part of the neighborhood, just watching the hours go by. And our radio flicked on. We were being dispatched to another place as somebody had reported strange noises coming from an abandoned warehouse. My partner seemed more annoyed. I was ecstatic. Finally, something to do. I was so afraid I would get nothing to do on one of my first nights out. I was willing to check out every corner of that warehouse, even if the noise just turned to be a family of raccoons. So we said to check out what the ruckus might be. We drove deep into the neighborhood. You know how in Detroit there are some places that were basically just left to rot? Well, the warehouse was located in one of those empty spots. Every house for miles seemed to be in a progressive state of decay. We began wondering who would have reported a noise disturbance in such a place. Nobody seemed to be living near. We got to the place and parked the car. The warehouse was basically just a rundown, barely standing building. The roof was missing in some parts, most of the windows were just shards, and the walls were blackened almost all around. The doors were so rusty it seemed that they would become dust the moment we tried to open them. But that was not the only thing. The place had a vibe. I don't know how to describe it. It felt like a place you should stay away from. Both my partner and I knew it. He looked at me after taking a look at the building, suggested we both claim we found nothing inside to get out. I felt very tempted, but I needed to know I could handle this job and be a proper officer. It was time to improve myself, so I refused his offer and told him we should just give a quick look around in case something might be going on inside. He rolled his eyes at me but reluctantly agreed. We got our guns, flashlights ready, getting out of the car. I immediately noticed the heat. It was an early fall night, so it wasn't exactly cold. However, when we stepped out of the car, I swear the temperature had risen like 20 degrees. I had to leave my jacket in the car. My partner just took this as another bad sign and insisted on leaving. He was also the very superstitious kind. I needed to just take a look around and felt like I'd truly done my job. We approached the factory and the temperature was just soaring the closer we got to it, like it was a furnace. I now started to sweat. It felt almost like the heat was coming from the building itself. We got to one of the doors. I tried to grab the handle to pry it open. The moment I touched it, the metal felt burning hot. I cursed, immediately removing my hand. I looked at the handle, and even though it felt like it was red hot, it seemed completely normal. It left faint burning marks all over my hand, and my partner and I were beginning to freak out. He once again repeated we should just leave the place and call the fire department. We turned around and were about to head back when we had heard the screams and the pounding. In the blink of an eye, every door and wall was being desperately pounded by what must have been dozens of people, and all sorts of screams and wailings were coming from inside. My partner and I bolted straight to the car, but Ben Way, my hero complex, kicked in. Completely idiotic, I headed straight back to one of the window openings. As I approached again, the screams got louder, the heat it being almost unbearable. I could feel my eyelashes getting singed. As soon as I got close enough, I looked inside, expecting to find something that could be making and responsible for all the noise. The building was empty, just a rundown warehouse with their floors covered in black and rubble. I got a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, so I bolted out without even looking back. I got inside the car where my partner was very patiently waiting for me. We drove away very quickly as we got out, and my heartbeat finally slowed. Those voices, they still resonated in my head. They were screaming in pain, pleading for help, and of course nobody took us seriously at all back at the station. Even the fire department got incredibly annoyed when they found nothing. They were sure somebody was playing a prank, and they were not fans of pranks, especially when it involved them wasting their time. But from then on, I was very weary of night patrols, even more so when they involved desolated places, all dilapidated buildings where gangs and criminals would go to hang out. After this, I never came across something like that afterwards. To be fair, I have not been to that part of the city ever since that night. I have done some research though, and turns out around 50 years ago the place was actually a textile factory that burned to the ground in a very uncontrollable fire. A massive conflagration. A lot of people unfortunately did not make it out. The factory was then rebuilt from the ground up not too long after. I'm sorry I don't know the dates. I believe the screams we had heard were from the ghosts that were left behind. Scars left by the tragic events. I still don't know if that's really what it was, but whatever it was terrified me and makes me feel very sad about all of it. I grew up in southern Georgia in the woods and swamps, hunting and hanging daily. Fast forward 20 years. I'm on my lease hunting property near Whitmire, South Carolina. I found it strange that the old guys in the club would never ever hunt alone in these woods. I normally carry a .30-06 while in the woods. One evening it was getting late, 20 minutes or so maybe before dark. I'm watching some small ponds, sitting over a road in the tall pines. I'm in my climber maybe 10 feet or so up in the tree. I love the woods but hate heights. The woods are loud, but then very quiet. Okay, I thought. I was just hoping for a big buck. The next thing I hear is someone walking towards me in the small pines, but then they just stop. It's getting really dark. I start hearing deep groans where the walking had stopped. I'm thinking that it was a bear or a cat, which would be very uncommon in this area. A big cat, maybe. But bears this far south is not normal. It gets very quiet again. I could see the small road well in the moonlight. The next thing I hear, the groans are immediately under me, almost beside me. Now the groans are becoming growls. Also, the odor was a bit overwhelming, just like a dead animal in the woods. I thought that a stinky animal was climbing on my tree and felt like I was going to be grabbed. I started moving a bit, trying to get my gun pointed down and lifting my feet. I was shaking because I was freaking scared. I could hear heavy breaths. I started yelling down, "If you're a club member trespassing, I don't care. Just identify yourself or I'm gonna freaking start shooting." I thought someone was trying to get at me in the tree stand. I never heard another sound and the foul odor was gone. I put my gun on my back and started slowly climbing down the tree. No more than 2 or 3 steps down the tree I smelled that awful odor again. Then I heard a low groan. He was right in front of my face, but it was so dark that I saw nothing. It scared me so bad I stood up and jumped into the dark in the other direction. When I hit the ground I rolled around, jumped to my feet, and ran down to the road. I ran as hard as I could to the gravel road where I could see well in the moonlight. At this time I remembered that my buddy was down at the bottom of the road in the small pines where I put him in a big box stand. I didn't see his light, so I had to run down that road to get to the bottom by the rivers. He was down by the rivers. When I ran up to him he said, "Man, there's some weird SHT going down. We need to go." We slowly walked together back up toward the gravel road. I heard someone walking on both sides of us all the way. I think my buddy was hearing it too. We didn't speak during the entire walk, maybe 500 to 600 yards, for some reason. I didn't feel my gun was going to help. I had hollered earlier threatening to shoot, and whoever this was, they weren't scared. When we got to the gravel road, the entire atmosphere had changed. It was almost 11 o'clock at night by then. My buddy didn't talk much. We went back to camp and had some food. We went to bed. I could hear him rolling around all night and I didn't sleep a wink. This happened a few years back. We're close with our next door neighbors and they were getting their kitchen remodeled. My mom was over at their house chatting with them. I decided that I wanted to go over and see the kitchen too, so I head out my front door. It's a straight line from my front door to the neighbor's front door. Looking to my right was the main road and the houses across it. Our driveway is a connected double driveway with a small extension by the edge for extra cars to park, by the road. Near that is a street lamp. The neighbors 2 doors down from us, one across from our neighbors, run a small home caring for mentally challenged people. By their driveway under the street lamp was a small black car parked under it, front facing towards the street lamp. The lamp illuminated a small squirrel-like creature under it. I love animals of all types, so naturally I slowed my pace to look at the small squirrel. Suddenly it stood up in its hind legs and morphed into a small figure similar to a kid. It ducked behind the small car and I didn't see it again. My memory from there is very foggy. I can barely remember what happened. It could very well have been the shadow of a squirrel or just my imagination, but I'm sure I saw something that day. A few months ago my sibling was visiting their partner for a small party and they said they had seen a figure in the street. Help me identify what I ran into? About a year ago I had moved to a new area in northern Utah, USA. I quite enjoy hiking alone and went on a new trail with my dog one morning around 8 a.m. About 2 miles into the main trail I came across a path that seemed to have been untouched for some time, but I wanted to explore so I jumped off the main path. 1 to 2 miles into this smaller trail I hiked into what looked like a camping area, but I had not seen it on any of my maps nor in the area reviews, so I thought this was a bit strange. I hiked past this, then suddenly had a horrible feeling of dread and I froze. The forest had gone silent and my dog was frozen staring at a nearby bush. Then said bush rustled. Whatever moved inside the bush seemed large, human-sized or bigger. I stood staring when suddenly whatever was there started making loud clicking sounds with its tongue. It was strange because 1, these sounds were much too loud to be human, and 2, they were being made in patterns and increments. After some time, the thing quickly moved up the mountain. Though still obscured by trees, I got a decent idea of how fast it could move. It was again much too quick to be human. It continued clicking, then I saw it dash up and over a ridge. It was tall, at least 6 feet, 1.8 meters, and it had stark black and white coloring. I know my animals and it was like nothing I have ran into or researched before. I had a coworker swear to me that it was a skinwalker. Though I am curious if there is a different cryptic or folklore being that matches this description better. I posted this elsewhere and was referred to this subreddit. I would just like to have a good idea of what I could be dealing with. It all started one night a few years ago when I was hanging out with a guy friend of mine, let's call him D, and his cousin. D and I had really come to bond over some of our strange beliefs and experiences. The story I'm about to tell wasn't the first foray, for either of us, into things of an otherworldly nature, but for me it was one of the most significant, and had a lasting impact on how I view these things. I was living in Chicago at the time, and working at a bar somewhat near downtown. If you believe in superstitions and fairy tales, it would be easy to assume that strange things only happen to people deep in the woods, or in remote locations, and that a city such as Chicago would be mainly devoid of supernatural or otherworldly experiences. It's easy to assume that densely populated areas wouldn't exactly be a breeding ground for this kind of strange activity, but you would be wrong. On this particular night, it was slow at work, and D and his cousin just happened to be in the area. He texted me to ask what my plans were, so I suggested they come to my place for a quick drink before we closed, since it was already nearing 2 a.m. I finished my side work just as they were arriving, 10 minutes till 2, so we all had a quick drink and took off to find another bar that was still open. But I think it must have been a Sunday or something, because everything in the area was closed. So we decided to head back to our neighborhood on the far north side of the city. As we were deciding what to do, D casually mentioned that he knew a liquor store in the northern suburbs that was open till 3 a.m. every night. So we devised an impromptu plan to grab some beers and have a late night stroll on the nearby beach. I would like to mention that this particular beach was about a 10-minute walk from where I was living at the time, and had a bike trail with a park that I would often rollerblade or walk through. When we got to the park, everything seemed normal. Both the parking lot and the park itself seemed empty, and we assumed the beach to be empty as well, as everything was perfectly quiet and still. By this time it was about 3 a.m., so we didn't expect anyone else to be there. As we were getting our beers out of the car, I noticed it was a full moon that night. We often went on nighttime adventures in the suburbs when we were bored, although never to this particular beach, and even on college campuses we barely ever ran into anyone. But as we walked through the park I noticed how still and quiet everything was. As soon as we stepped foot onto the sand where the beach started, something shifted. The energy changed. And we started hearing laughter. Coming from where? It sounded like it was just out in front of us a ways, just right there, out in the water. But no one was there. It was a clear night, and with the full moon you could see for literally miles in every direction. There was no one there. But yet the laughing persisted. And it sounded like two voices, a man and a woman. And you could clearly hear them in the water, splashing and playing and laughing and talking, but there was just simply nobody there. At this point we were all actively scanning up and down the beach and literally asking each other, "Yo, are you guys hearing this?" It sounded like they were out there playing in the waves, in the middle of the night, laughing and talking, but we couldn't make out what they were saying, and we simply couldn't see anyone out there besides ourselves. We all agreed that it was weird, and maybe we should have simply taken it as a sign to leave, but we ended up deciding to simply ignore it, and headed to the opposite end of the beach. Maybe they're out there skinny dipping and they don't want us to see them? I offered this as a possible solution, but I think I was just trying to rationalize what didn't make rational sense. So we ignored it. We walked to the complete opposite end of the beach, which may have been roughly the size of a football field, but when we got there we noted that the voices had not changed volume. It still sounded like they were out in the waves right in front of us. So we ignored it even harder. We opened some beers, put it out of our minds, and frankly didn't think too much of it for a while as we talked about random things and I took pictures of the moon over the water. This went on for about 20 minutes and we weren't thinking too much anymore about the voices or the laughter, until it suddenly stopped. The sudden absence of sound made us immediately uneasy, mainly because what the F just happened? Why did the voices stop? Did they get sucked into an undertow? Are they out there in the waves drowning? We all looked at each other with the same question. What the F do we do? Here I am, on the beach in the middle of the night, where we're not supposed to be, drinking beers, and now there's people potentially drowning. What do you even do in this scenario? Call the cops? Run out and try to save them? All I can assume is that in this moment, we were all contemplating these same horrifying scenarios, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, down to the other end of the beach. A wave of relief washed over me, thinking at first that it might be these people coming up on the beach. So without even thinking I started to point and say, "Look, there they are. It's two." Realizing at this moment they aren't people, it's two dogs? And sure enough, we all see what seems to clearly be the silhouettes of two dogs, trotting towards us down the beach. Now this was a decent-sized beach, but these things were not simply walking. They were moving with some speed and managed to clear half of it in about as much time as it took me to process what they even were. And as they started to get closer, I started to notice that they had very large ears, tails, and paws. Holy F you guys, I don't think those are dogs, I said. Those are coyotes or something, and they're coming right at us. Now I had seen coyotes in the area and knew they were no strangers to even densely populated areas, but seeing what appears to be two wild animals trotting towards a group of humans in the middle of the night is wildly disconcerting. At this point they suddenly stopped in their tracks, about halfway down the beach. They seemed to assess us for a moment, when all of a sudden I saw, with all clarity, the silhouettes of these two animals rise onto their hind legs and become, instead, the shapes of two people. Immediately I turned around to my friends and exclaimed, "Tell me you just saw that shit." "Yeah," said D, who looked terrified. "They just stood up." That was all he had to say for me to know that we had all seen the same thing. When we turned back to look, they were already gone, like they had simply disappeared into thin air. D's cousin said, we need to get the F out of here. And so we did. But it wasn't so much sheer panic as a sense of vague unease. We didn't run away screaming, we just simply quickly grabbed our things and started walking towards the exit. As we walked past the lifeguard tower, we noticed them, as if they had simply materialized again. There they were, the two of them, a silhouette of a man and a woman against the moonlit sky, sitting atop the lifeguard tower. We all slowed our step as we noticed them. Should we say something to them? I asked aloud. I couldn't help myself, the curiosity was overwhelming. No. Dee's cousin whispered sharply at me. Dee grabbed my hand and dragged me onward. Don't say anything to them. Just keep moving. So we left. We got in the car silently. We took the short drive back to my apartment silently. We sat in the car quietly for a few minutes, smoking a cigarette. Okay, I said finally, breaking the silence, but we all experienced that shit, right? Did we just see, like, werewolves or something? And in that few minutes we rehashed the entire experience together, from the disembodied voices to the shape-shifting creatures. And although we agreed that we had all seen and experienced the same thing, we also noted that if we had been alone, and seen something like that, we might have just written it off? I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, Dee said, until I realized you guys saw it too. That was basically the feeling we all had through the whole experience. As if we had tried to write it off until it was nearly staring us right in the face. But honestly, this wasn't my first experience with things of an otherworldly nature, and it seemed to me, from experience, that it's best to just let it go. So I did let it go. I got out of the car, and went into my apartment, and honestly just went straight to bed. Like, I knew it was a strange thing we had all just experienced, but I really just hoped and chose to assume that that would be the end of it. And truthfully, I went to bed that night and slept like a baby. I never really felt like I was in danger, or that something malicious had followed me. I thought that was the end of it. Until I started having dreams about them a few weeks later. As it turns out, they had followed me, and they wanted to talk with me. One night, a few weeks after our sighting of the strange shape-shifting creatures, I had a dream. I didn't know that it was a dream while it was happening. It all felt so real. It was like I remembered nodding off in bed, and then I came to somewhere else. When I came to, I found myself standing on an empty beach. I quickly realized it was the same beach where we had seen the creatures a few weeks prior. But I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. I just fell asleep in my bed, and woke up on the beach. The transition was so jarring I started to panic, wondering if I had walked there, or worse, if I was losing my mind. My unease grew as I realized the winds were blowing and the skies were dark, as if there was a bad storm approaching. I thought about the things we saw on the beach that night, wondering if they had somehow led me here. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, I saw something. Black, inky, amorphous shapes, rising out of the crashing waves of Lake Michigan. I worried that I had somehow disturbed some ancient lake spirits. As I watched the shapes rise out of the waves, they took the form of two large, black dogs, each with glowing yellow eyes. They maintained this shape until they reached the beach, where they stood on their hind legs, and suddenly they were no longer dogs but a man and a woman, strange, ethereal-looking people, with long black hair and the same glowing yellow eyes. They just stared at me. And I stared at them. And they stared at me. And I stared at them a little while more until I finally managed to muster the words, "What are you?" They exchanged a baffled glance with each other. No, but like, what are you? The looks of confusion on their faces grew. In fact, it seemed like a mix of confusion and offense at the very question. In my dumbfounded state, I repeated the question a few more times, "What are you?" But they seemed either unwilling or unable to respond to it. So I asked more questions. Different questions. Okay, if you can't tell me what you are, can you tell me where you came from? Like, have you always been on this beach? Do you come from a different realm? More looks of confusion. You can't even tell me where you came from? Like, When were you born? Do you remember being born? Suddenly the woman snapped at me. Do you remember being born? And suddenly I was the one who didn't know how to answer the question. Do you remember being a baby, or an infant, or even a toddler for that matter? She seemed thoroughly annoyed by my line of questioning. Well, no, of course not, I stuttered. No, of course not, she said. You don't remember that far back? Well, neither do we. But surely you must know something about your origins, or where you came from. I asked. I may not remember being born, but I have parents and family and doctors who were there to confirm when and where I was born. Well, we don't have any of that, she said matter-of-factly. In fact, things like us. Well, we're the oldest things we know of. We don't have parents or grandparents to ask. We don't have anyone who came before us to ask where we came from. And frankly, we simply don't remember that far back. I was dumbfounded. I had no idea how to respond. So you want to know where we come from? She continued. Well, I can't tell you that for certain. All I can tell you is my opinions, my beliefs. So if you ask me where we come from, I would say that we come from God. And I would say that it's the same God that created you, that created us, that created all of reality. But the truth is, if God does exist, or some sort of creators to all of this, they quite simply are not around anymore to ask. But this is just my belief, and that's all I can give you. Feeling in a whirlwind from such a complex and unexpected response, I clamored for something to follow it up with. So, how old do you think you are exactly, or how far back do you remember? She sighed a deep sigh, and started pointing around in various directions saying things like, do you see the water? Do you see the waves on the water? Well, yes, I said, obviously I see the water. You see the beach? And the grasses growing on the sand dunes? Yes, I see the beach. Do you see the hills beyond the beach, and the trees growing on those hills? Yes. Yes, I see the hills, and the trees. What does that have to do with anything? Well, she sighed. We're old. At least as old as the landscape itself, if not older. So as long as this has been here, we've been here. As long as the water and the beach and the hills have been here, we've been here. We're as old as the hills, you might say. At this point I was exasperated. Okay, that's all cool and good for you and whatever, but what does that have to do with me? Like, what does that have to do with me? They were both silent for a moment. Surely there's some reason you sought me out, right? Surely there's some reason you've approached me to tell me all of this? More silence. So, what does this have to do with me? Just then the man, who hadn't said anything to me the entire time, just sort of shrugged and said, I don't know. We just thought it might be nice to have a human to talk to for a change, you know? And that must have made me so angry that I woke myself up because the last thing I remember is yelling for a change from what? And then I was waking up in my bed and it was morning. I had more dreams of them after this. Most of them were vague and I couldn't really remember much. When I told my friend D about this, I was surprised to hear him say that he had been having dreams about them, too. He didn't claim to remember having any specific conversations with them, just vague dreams of shape-shifting entities. But as for me, I did have one other dream where a conversation was had. In this dream I was at work. In real life I work as a server, but for some reason in this dream I was the bartender. It was the same bar, however, that I was working at in real life at the time. It was a slow night, there were a few tables but no one at the bar. I was contemplating stepping out for a cigarette when a woman walked through the front door. Immediately she caught my eye. Something about her was dreamlike, the way she moved was ethereal. She had long black, wavy hair that seemed to flow unnaturally, and she may have been wearing a fur coat. When she sat down and made eye contact with me, I immediately noticed her eyes. They were a bright, vibrant and unnatural shade of yellow, almost as if they were glowing. I just knew as soon as I looked at her that everything about her was entirely strange. But I didn't know that this was a dream and I didn't want her or any of the other customers to think I was crazy, so I greeted her as I would any customer. "Hey, what's up, how's it going?" "Yeah," she said, in a complete non sequitur, "so I've been really into werewolves lately." She slammed both hands down on the bar emphatically as she said the word werewolves, staring at me with wide eyes and a strange grin. Okay?" I responded, her comments catching me off guard. "Yeah, have you ever heard of werewolves?" At this point I was sure she was crazy. Or cryptids? "Have you heard of those?" In my mind I'm thinking, lady, is this your first day on planet Earth? Who hasn't heard of werewolves? But I just laughed uncomfortably and played along. "Yes, I've heard of them." "Why?" "Okay, so you've heard of werewolves and cryptids and stuff? Cool. Yeah, I'm like really into that stuff, like I want to know all of the folklore about these things, and I want to know what people think about these things." "That's cool, can I get you a drink?" Honestly, I was just trying to hurry up and serve her so I could go out for a smoke. She ordered a beer, I poured it and handed it to her, and she continued on with her strange line of questioning. "So have you ever seen anything like that?" she asked as I handed over her beer. "Like what? Like a werewolf?" "Yes, silly, like a werewolf." She made a playful smirk. "'Cause I just want to know. I want to know what people think about these things." "Well, I was about to step out front for a quick smoke if you don't mind. Maybe we can continue this conversation when I get back?" At this point I was honestly getting more than a little weirded out by her energy and her attempts at talking about some weird shit with me. Sure, she said, so I went outside, but as soon as I lit my cigarette, I turned around and she was standing behind me. "I'm sorry, I just couldn't wait, I wanted to talk about it now. I don't want to freak you out, I'm just conducting some research, you know? Trying to find out what people think about these things." I tried to steer the conversation politely back to her by flipping the question. "Well, what do you think about these things? Do you believe in werewolves?" "I don't really know, I just want to know what you think. Like, I'm fascinated by the kinds of stories and myths people tell, the good, the bad, the ugly, I don't care. I just want to know. Do you have any stories? Any experiences?" This went on a few more times, with me trying to redirect the conversation, and her directing it back at me, until finally I told her firmly but nicely, "Look, I do believe in these things and I would love to have that conversation, I really would, but I'm at work right now and this isn't the time or the place, you know? Like I can't be standing out front, smoking cigarettes, and talking about this kind of stuff with people. I'm sorry, I just really can't talk about this stuff at work, that's all." "That's okay," she sighed, "I understand. I really should get going anyways." She smiled kind of a dejected smile and I suddenly felt a little bad for being so dismissive. "Okay," I said, "I'm sorry I can't talk more about that stuff right now, but I have to get back to work." "Okay," she said, "have a good one," and she started to walk off down the street. As I walked back through the door I stopped and, for some unknown reason, joked, "Oh, by the way, you're my favorite cryptid." She winked at me, and as I was walking back through the door into the building, everything made sense. I realized this was a dream, I realized who she was, and why she was asking these questions. And I turned back around and ran out the door as if I was going to confront her, but I woke up. I moved away from that apartment and from Chicago completely after that. I moved back home to Michigan. I still have strange dreams sometimes, but I'm not sure if those particular entities followed me or not. If I'm being honest, at the end of the day, they were pretty interesting to talk to. And I think if I got the chance, I would talk to them again sometime. So that's the story of how I met the Loop Guru, and they were pretty nice, actually. Hope you enjoyed reading it. If anyone has any insights or has experienced anything similar, I'd love to hear it. My theory is that these were not actually werewolves at all but rather some type of fey entities. I'd love to hear others' thoughts. Hello, what do people think this thing was? A demon, goblin, Something else? Why was it in my house? This took place in a suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota around 2015. My father was a police officer for 30 years. He is a respected member of the city council, and an all-around reliable dude. He told me that a few years back he walked into the bathroom late at night to get ready for bed and a 4-foot-tall demon thing was standing on the bathroom rug facing him. He didn't feel scared, but sensed that the creature was just being annoying. It had long arms hanging almost to the floor, and had brown fur, but wasn't super hairy. He said it had a bat-like face, but not quite as smushed. His first reaction was to say, in the name of Jesus, leave my house. He said it just kinda stared at him, then jumped up and vanished through the closed bathroom window. No broken glass. End of story. I am 20 and me and my buddies enjoy late night walks on the trails within the various conservation areas in my region of southwestern Ontario. Late last week we decided to check out an area called Pleasant Valley. To my knowledge, this area has a deep-rooted history with the Underground Railroad, indigenous peoples, as well as the War of 1812 if I am not mistaken, given its proximity to Lake Erie. We entered the woods at about 2 a.m. and immediately upon entering I was overcome with a bad feeling, and after walking for some time the feeling progressively worsened until we reached 2 bent trees in an X over the path. My one buddy pointed out the fact that it's bad juju to go underneath and we should just call it a night, as we all felt watched. As soon as we turn around and start to head back, the entire forest seemed dramatically quieter. We all hear a loud, distinctively human whistle behind us. Almost like how you would call a dog over. There is no way anyone could have been out there at that hour, and there is no homes in close enough proximity for someone to be out and about. We all ran and I was honestly terrified. Me and my friends are all relatively big guys and we are all comfortable in the woods, so it takes a lot to get us running. Lol. Any ideas? I was born in 1968. I am the son of a miner father and a miner. I am the father of 2 children. The incident happened to me in the mine where I worked a year or 2 before I retired. Everything started after an accident in the mine. That day, I went to the workplace as usual. In the morning, after having breakfast in the canteen of the workplace, I got into the cage to go 260 meters underground. When I say cage, I mean an elevator. We mine workers preferred to call it a cage instead of an elevator because it was a simple device that worked with a large crane rather than an elevator. Anyway, I went down to the mine. After working until the end of the shift, I started walking towards the bottom of the shaft. We call the place where we got into the cage the bottom of the shaft. As I was walking slowly, an engine passed by me quickly. What I call an engine can be considered as a small train. It was a relatively simple device compared to the train, pulling only wagons weighing up to 1 ton at most. There were workers on the engine. Normally they are forbidden to do this, but sometimes when the workers are very tired after work, they ride on the engine to avoid walking. I continued to walk slowly as the engine sped past me. Then there was shouting coming from up ahead. Someone seemed to be moaning in a wheezing voice. I moved towards the direction of the sound in order to understand exactly what was happening. I started to look around carefully. When I approached the place where the sound came from, I saw that someone was lying in the water channel on the side of the air door. Blood was flowing from the person lying in the water channel as if from a faucet. At that moment I went into a short-term shock. In that chaos, we immediately carried the injured person to the lift entrance, which we call the bottom of the shaft, and sent him to the hospital. I still could not get over the shock of that image. That day, that person who was injured in that accident died. This incident affected me deeply. My psychology turned upside down. According to what I learnt later, the accident happened as follows. While the workers were traveling with the engine, the air door did not open. Since the engine was also fast, the engine hit the door with great violence. The worker who was caught between the engine and the door was crushed badly during this impact. In the days following this incident, when I passed through that gate, it always seemed to me as if someone was still lying in the water channel. I couldn't pass through there by myself. Since the hearth was not sufficiently lit, it was always very dark inside the hearth. It was only illuminated by fluorescent lamps, which were very sparsely placed in certain parts of the hearth. Because of the effect of this incident, I was completely disenchanted with work. I didn't feel like going to work at all, but I had to. Anyway, one day when I was at work again, I was the last one left at the end of work in the area of the mine where I was working. When I looked around, everyone had left. I sat down somewhere. Such a weight fell on me that it seemed like a lifetime to go from there to the lift area, which the workers called the bottom of the shaft. I said to myself, I'll rest a little where I'm sitting and then I'll go. My eyes closed for a while. I was between sleep and wakefulness. I saw a man approaching me from ahead, holding a lamp in his hand. There is no work left at the stove at this hour. I guess he stayed later like me, I said to myself. That light that was approaching me suddenly disappeared. Oh my God. Where did this man go? I said to myself. Then I thought, let me sit for 1 or 2 more minutes. Maybe the man who just disappeared will come back and we can go to the lift together. Then my eyes closed again. I don't know how much time passed. Suddenly I woke up with a very severe slap. But what a slap. I thought my neck was broken. I immediately recovered and looked around me. There was no one. It was impossible for someone to hit me and run away. For this reason, I started running towards the lift in fear and panic. That day I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. 1 or 2 weeks later, I was the last one again. This time I hurried up and went straight to the lift entrance. As I sat down and waited for the lift to arrive, I noticed that something jet black was coming towards me. It had a hand lamp and a hard hat, but neither of them was lit. It was slowly approaching me. I called out from afar, "Master. What's wrong? Did the lamp malfunction?" He didn't answer. Instead, it kept coming towards me slowly. I felt a strong sense of fear that I didn't know why. I wanted to get up and leave. I even wanted to run away, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. Although he was very close to me, I couldn't see his face or body clearly. It was as if the man coming towards me was not a tangible substance but a shadow, a silhouette. "Don't ever sleep on the hearth again," he said to me. I could feel the man's speech not in my ears but in my brain. He spoke to me almost telepathically and disappeared. I had heard of such events from a few other people before, but I didn't believe it. At that moment, those stories I had heard went through my mind. I read all the prayers I knew. That black silhouette had not harmed me, but living that moment had further disrupted my already broken psychology. I couldn't get up from where I was sitting for another 1 to 2 minutes. After a while, I pulled myself together and walked away from there. When I told my friends what had happened to me, they did not believe me. When I told what happened to me to the imam of the village where I lived, the imam believed me and said the following: "They are the owners of the mines." As you know, according to Islamic belief, the souls of martyrs can choose to stay in this world instead of going to the hereafter if they wish. According to a saying of the Islamic prophet Muhammad, those who die under the rubble are considered martyrs just like those who die in war. That's why we call people who died in the mines mine martyrs. Most probably that thing you saw in the mine was the spirit of a mine martyr and it warned you. He wanted to protect you. After that day, I never slept in the mine again. About the story, hello, I am a journalist living in Turkey. Investigating the paranormal is my special interest. The story you have just read is a true story that was shared with me by one of my readers on condition of anonymity. I don't remember the year, but I was in winter, I think like 2016 or around then. I had an experience with what can only be described as a draugr or ghoulme, and my friend drove past it in New England. It was on a dark street, but it gave the most horrible feeling. Near my old house where a lot of creepy stuff happened. Paranormal stuff, the house was old and haunted stuff would move, doorknobs would turn, etc. But this was unrelated to the incident. Both me and my friend experienced it and we were both like, maybe it was just a person? But we both got this horrible sensation and it just definitely wasn't. I was really sick at the time and got even sicker. Definitely felt malevolent to both of us, and we both found ourselves looking out the window that night with a feeling like it had followed us home. Last night a party composed of 15 men and boys, all of them armed, set out in quest of the strange animal that is alleged to have its lair in a cavern along the Swatara Creek. The net result of the expedition is that one member of the party claims that he got a glimpse of the mysterious monster and fired a shot at it and missed. That is, he presumes that he failed to hit the beast, as he claims that it shook its head savagely and ran away. Another member of the party verifies this story and says the animal disappeared in Adam Bolt's meadow. This morning another party, comprising 20 men, visited the vicinity of the cave. While several were watching the place, a cry was heard and the watchers turned and saw the creature bathing in the Swatara a short distance south of where they were standing. Several shots were fired but all were without effect. Members of this party described the creature as an animal weighing between 200 and 300 pounds, light in color, and having a sandy head. Mr. Malfair, a reputable citizen, asserts that he has seen the mysterious visitor running about in Mr. Rasp's meadow, between the Swatara and the Quittapahilla. At one farm in the vicinity heads of 23 chickens were found. Some lay the slaughter to the beast and others say it would not take the bodies and leave the heads. Others claim that they have watched the cave on the Swatara and have seen nothing in the shape of an animal in that vicinity except chipmunks. Buddy and I left camp in my rig to grab some firewood. Couple miles down the road we came around a corner and saw a sheep herder we'd met earlier, open range land, talking to a guy in the middle of the road. As we got closer we could see the other guy had a pistol pointed in the face of the sheep herder. We throttled down to break up whatever was going on, but the guy with the gun took off when he saw us barreling down the road. The sheep herder didn't speak English, from Peru, working in the States to send money back to his family, and was scared out of his mind. Him and his 500 sheep ended up camping with us that night, where we shared dinner and tried to communicate with hand signals. My fiancé and I hiked into some forest in Ontario. We had a friend drop us off at the side of an old logging road in the middle of nowhere, and we hiked into the woods due east. The road ran north/south. So basically all we had to do was stay due east hiking in, and due west hiking out, and we would reach the road again for our rendezvous at a predetermined time a couple of days later. There are no natural predators this far south such as bears or wolves, so for protection I only brought a K-bar knife and some bear spray, in case coyotes took an interest in our 2 dogs that accompanied us. The logging road was no longer in use by any industry, and we had hiked into the woods a few kilometers, so the chances of running into another human were nil. In addition, hunting is not permitted in the area, and there is no water nearby for fishing. There really wasn't any reason for anyone else to be out there in the middle of the woods that far off the road. No cell service, although I did bring a flare gun and multiple flares in case we ran into trouble to signal for help. No GPS, just a compass. We were careful hiking in, and didn't do anything risky to avoid injuries in this remote place. It was early fall, but it was unseasonably cold. Well below freezing. Lots of leaves on the ground and still on the trees, but no snow yet. We set up camp in some thick woods. You could barely see 50 feet away, the trees/bushes were so dense. We were totally isolated and felt completely safe. It was so cold and so dark at night, it was moonless and cloudy, that we went to bed early to stay warm. I'm a heavy sleeper and next thing I know, I'm awakened by my dog pawing at my face. It is pitch black, and I can't even see him. I go to pet him, but something is wrong. As I touched him, I could feel his fur standing straight up, and he was completely rigid, facing the door of the tent. He was clearly on guard and very alert. At first I assumed there was a woodland creature nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That is unusual, because I often camp alone no problem, and am not easy spooked. My dog and I just stayed there frozen and alert, for at least a couple of minutes. My fiancé and other dog were still asleep next to us. It was 3:30 a.m., I checked my phone after the incident. The fire was out. No moon. Complete blackness. Just as I was letting my guard down, I hear the most unexpected thing. A notification going off on a phone just outside of our tent, maybe 15 to 20 feet away, and I see a faint glow. I hear a male voice mutter "OF," or something to that effect, and hear them running through the leaves away from our tent. They were clearly smacking into tree branches etc. and swearing as they did so. At this point they turn on their flashlight as they run, and I can see the beam flailing wildly around in the woods, occasionally back onto our tent. The dogs start going ballistic. I grab my knife and look at my phone. It's 3:30 a.m. I screamed out, "If you come back here, I'll blow your head off." I'm assuming he had a satellite phone, or really good cell service to get a notification like that. The other weird thing was, he fled deeper into the woods and nothingness, not west towards the logging road. Needless to say, we packed up in the cold and hiked back to the road, watching our backs the entire time. We just walked down the road towards far-off civilization until we ran into some other campers set up right next to the road 7 or 8 kilometers away from where we came out of the woods. It was just after first light. They let us use their satellite phone, and we called our friend to come pick us up a day early. Upon hearing our story, the campers decided they would pack up as well and get out of the area. Lesson learned. I do not camp in the wilderness anymore without a satellite phone and a 12 gauge. A few years ago, me and 3 of my buddies went for what was supposed to be an overnight hiking/camping trip in the Smokies. After about 3 hours of hiking, we were just starting to set up camp for the night when a freak thunderstorm hit us out of nowhere. We scrambled to pack up our stuff and miraculously managed to find a very small cave, not big enough for any animals to be hiding in it. It was more like a rocky alcove that had just enough space to shield the 4 of us from the rain. We spent the night in the cave. One of my friends even started showing symptoms of hypothermia, but thankfully I had an emergency blanket in my backpack that helped him. The next morning we tried to find our way back to the trail. It took us 2 hours of hiking to realize we were very lost. It took us 3 days to find our way back to civilization. There was 2 men pulling a big black duffel bag. We were up high on a hill so they couldn't really see us. They had shovels. We watched pretending to be spies, sharing the binoculars. When they looked in our way, we ran. We ran back to the bikes, then rode back to camp as fast as possible. At that time we camped with about 15 other families. Travel trailer camping group. No one at all believed us. We begged them to call the police. No one believed us. We still tell our family now they should have listened to us. I'm now 35 and my brother and cousin are 32. To this day no one believes us. We went camping in Virginia a few years ago. Throughout the evening we could hear what sounded like some sort of exotic bird 150-200 yards away, and it was loud. It started getting late and the fire was winding down, so we decided to turn in. We each had our own tent and I got bedded down and broke out the Kindle to read a bit. About 45 minutes later, I could hear something walking around my tent. Didn't give a second thought as I grew up in the country with deer, possum, raccoons, etc. Then all of a sudden, whatever that bird was let off one of those piercing caws about 12 inches away from my head through the wall of the tent, and I about shit myself. The fear went away quickly once I realized it was the bird, but it scared me so bad I was laughing at myself. My husband and I spent the night way out in the northern woods near a lake. There is a looped camping trail where you can rent a site out a few days for a relatively cheap price. Each site is probably separated by 70 to 80 meters, so while you can somewhat see and hear your fellow campers, it's never enough to take away from the ambience. Once we've set up our tent and gotten our belongings in order, we decided to get a fire going and have our usual go-to outdoors dinner of roasted hot dogs. The night was beautiful, the fire gave off the perfect amount of heat and didn't smoke in our faces at all, and for the most part our neighbors didn't get too boisterous. By quiet hours, we bedded down and got in our tent to spend some time enjoying the serenity and peace. Until I realized for some reason our tent is sweating from the inside. And then it started raining hard. We take our valuables to the car immediately and get inside to wait out the weather before disassembling the tent. Our nearby neighbors all realize the weather situation as well, and we see them pack up and ship out one by one. This leaves us very much alone. This is where it gets insanely strange, and to this day neither of us are quite sure what we experienced. Out in the distance beyond our sight, I see what appears to be a red light, maybe attached to a lantern. However, the way this light moves is completely inorganic. It doesn't sway or bob as if being held by a human who is walking around. Rather, it snakes around in a perfect track and slowly comes closer and closer to our car. By this time we've killed the headlights and are just staring at this spectacle with a mixture of awe and horror. My husband gets out of the car at some point and calls out in the rain if anybody is there. Lo and behold, the light disappears. This left a most bewildering and eerie feeling deep in my gut. Something did not feel right at all. Sixth sense tingling and everything. At my urging, he gets back in the car and it doesn't take long for the light to reappear. By this point I'm ready to leave, tent be damned. But my husband insists if we're to leave, we have to pack up our tent because he doesn't want it stolen. So, I begrudgingly oblige, and while he stands watch with a flashlight, I get to work packing us up. I probably got it done in 5 minutes, maybe less. The entire time we were out there, we didn't see the red light. If we had, God, I don't know how I would have reacted, but I'm glad we were able to get our stuff and finally leave. Hello Den of Misfits. About 2 months ago my wife, son, and I moved to northern Alabama. We're in a rural area surrounded by many cattle and hearse fields. A couple times per week right around 1:30 to 2 a.m. our two large dogs will go absolutely ballistic and bark/growl at the front door, but nothing is outside. Our Ring camera hasn't really caught anything. Recently, I've been having weird dreams, alien encounters, coyote invasions, etc. I don't say anything to my wife or son about these dreams, but every time I have them my son tells us about his dreams. The night I had a dream that aliens were hovering around our house in a UFO trying to abduct us. He had a dream about aliens. The night I had a dream about coyotes being in the cattle field attacking our cats. He had a dream about coyotes too. There's been nothing said/done during the day related to aliens or coyotes. Do you have any idea of any creatures in northern Alabama that would cause this? I was a young police officer, fresh out of the academy and eager to make a difference on the streets. I had always dreamed of being a cop, and I was determined to do whatever it took to catch the bad guys and keep the city safe. One night, I was called to the scene of a brutal crime. The victims were brutally attacked, and there were bite marks all over their bodies. At first, I thought it might have been an animal attack, but the teeth marks were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were jagged and uneven, like nothing any animal I knew of could have made. I told my sergeant that I thought some kind of creature had attacked the victims, but he just laughed and told me I was insane. He said I should forget about it and focus on finding the real perpetrator. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this crime than met the eye. Feeling unsure of what to think, I decided to return to the crime scene on my own. As I walked through the dark, abandoned house, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my gun at the ready, unsure of what I might find. As I entered the room where the victims were found, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. There, crouched over one of the corpses, was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was a crawler, with long, spindly legs and a twisted, distorted body. It was sucking the blood from the corpse, and I could see its razor-sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. Without hesitation, I aimed my gun and fired. But the creature was too fast, and it dodged out of the way. It ran through the window and was gone before I could get off another shot. I ran to the window, but there was no sign of the creature. It had vanished into the night. I sat there, staring out into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I knew that no one would believe me if I told them about the crawler. They would think I was crazy, or worse, that I was covering up my own mistakes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, stalking the streets, preying on the innocent. I knew that I had to do something to stop it, but I didn't know where to start. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed my chance to stop the creature, and that it would continue to roam the city, hunting for its next victim. I sat there for hours, lost in thought, trying to come up with a plan. But it was no use, I couldn't think of anything that could stop the creature. And so, I sat there in the darkness, alone, unsure of what the future held. As the night went on, I realized that I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I had to tell someone about what I had seen, even if no one would believe me. So, I gathered my courage and went to my sergeant, and I told him everything. I was prepared to be laughed at, but he just looked at me with a serious face and told me that he would investigate the matter. I was relieved and at the same time, scared. Scared of what the truth might be, scared that the creature might be real and that it would come back for me. From that night on, I was a changed man, haunted by the memory of the crawler and the knowledge that somewhere out there, it was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. A friend and I saw something several years back. It was very thin and its skin looked as if it had a full-body latex suit on. Very shiny. Bone structure in its face but no eyes or orifices. You could see the ribs. Head was elongated and fingers long and pointy. Had a peculiar-looking gait to it. This was late at night and the creature was directly under a security light in my friend's backyard. We had been sitting quietly in his truck. This thing walked up not noticing us. Maybe 15 feet in front of us, directly under the security light. My friend screamed and it jumped and faced us. It then took off towards the woods. We had been gone for a while and just sitting in the driveway chilling before we went in. We had actually pushed the truck to the house because we had ran out of gas right before we got back to his house. We finally got brave enough to run into the house but the door was locked and he didn't have a key because he never locked the house. Then we go around the house to try to get through his bedroom window only to find that it was open. Not only was it open but the screen was wadded up and shredded on the ground. Anyone have any idea what this thing could have been? This was in 1996 or 97. I've never been able to figure it out. I was driving from Portland to Lincoln City to retrieve my work bag that I had left in Lincoln City over the weekend. I left Portland at 3 a.m. and had only had coffee and donuts to eat. There were not many other cars on the road at all, none that were going in a westerly direction that were within sight of me, and only about 2 cars passed me between Spirit Mountain Casino and the site where I had my sighting. I was driving about 55 miles per hour and had my bright lights on and it just came over a rise in the road shortly after you start down the back side of Murphy Hill. As I crested the rise out in the distance, I saw what I thought at the time was a deer on the left shoulder of the road about 200 yards out from me. I slowed down to 40 miles per hour or so because I didn't want it to jump in front of me, or if there were other deer in the area I might spook them into the road. As I got within 75 yards, the object began to move across the road from left to right. That is when I saw that it was not a deer and I thought it might be a bear, which I have seen cross a road before, but this was way different. The object was hunched over slightly and was on 2 legs and cleared the road in about 4 steps. The best way to describe the color was dark brown to black, and I would guess the hair to be 4 or 5 inches. The arms looked to come down to mid-thigh area. I did not see the eyes except for there seemed to be a deer-like shine coming from the face area, and the height to be about 7 feet plus as it disappeared over the edge of the road to the right. I was about 50 yards away by this time. I was starting to feel pretty weird, like this was something I had never seen. Hard to explain the feeling. As I passed the spot where it went over the bank, I tried to look over and see where it had gone. I was going about 25 miles per hour now as I went about 20 yards past the spot and stopped. I then reversed my car to the spot where I had seen it go over the bank. I stopped my car and left the engine running. I had my window rolled down slightly for airflow as I was driving when I stopped. I could smell a musty type smell, not real bad but strong enough to notice. I could hear some movement in the brush but not a lot because of the car noise and the fact that my window was only down 2 or 3 inches on the left side when the object was now on my right. I had a really strong feeling that I was being watched. Every hair on my body was rigid. I had goosebumps over my whole body. I have them now as I write about this, not as bad but the chills. I decided then that it would be a really good time to leave, so I drove off as fast as my metro would go. I made it to Lincoln City at 6 a.m. and had about 10 cars pass me going east on Highway 18 in that time. When I got there, I went to my girlfriend's to get my bag and was going to come right back to Portland to work. Instead, I stayed until 9 a.m. then left to go back to Portland. As I drove by the spot, I thought about stopping but decided against it. I know the area well though because I helped a lady who had rolled her car off the road in the same area many years ago. The bank in the area is about 7 feet down on both sides and is swampy in some places. I lived in Lincoln City for many years and have spent time in the woods alone and with others and have never felt or seen anything like this. I don't know what to make of it except for it being Bigfoot. No bear walks on its back legs like this. If you want to see the spot I can take you there, just let me know. Also, I drive this stretch of road 2 times, sometimes more, a week. Overall, I was left feeling uneasy and couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was an experience that I couldn't explain and still think about it to this day. I was probably 15 or late 14 at the time, midsummer time. Me and 2 of my friends left a girl's house late at night, basically sneaking out. She lived deep kinda in the countryside, about a 45-minute walk to get to the city line. We left about 2 in the morning. Me and my 2 friends, we stepped out of her country subdivision road onto a main paved country road. We took a left onto the main road. We look on our right, you could basically see just road and woods each direction with some mailboxes. But on the right side, our opposite direction at the top or end of our view on the road, we could see just a white light or reflector. Imagine. Obviously that wasn't on our mind. Our mind was not being caught by cops or anything out past curfew. We walked left the opposite direction. As walking cars occasionally drove by, so to be safe we would hide in the woods or tree line every passing car just in case a cop. Every time we would watch a car go by our opposite traveling direction, basically we would look back and the white object was getting closer quite fast. You could only see it in headlights. Once the headlights were gone, it was basically gone. We continued walking, all seeing it, just confused but didn't care to wait. We got to about the town line. This thing was probably only 200 to 500 feet behind us. Again, could only see it in passing headlights. None of the cars seemed to notice. When the creature was close enough, it has translucent white skin with big black hole eyes. Long limbs, looked pretty skinny but still could have been anywhere between 6 to 8 maybe more feet. We get into the start of town with house subdivision streets, basically town homes. Every 4-way we got to on our left, looking a 4-way our opposite block street over, we could see the thing walking with our pace. When I got a side view of it, I noticed its arms hung down pretty low. It's like it was looking at us but wasn't. Me and my friends that night weren't on any drugs and snuck outside at night quite a bit, so it wasn't just some fear or mistake. We were pretty, I guess, calm or casual because it kept distance. We were about in town and more worried about ourselves getting caught by the law. To this day I still ride my bike around town at night and have for years. Haven't seen anything at night like that since or before. I sometimes guess if it was just my vision, but both my friends saw it and definitely seen it 3 more times without headlights at opposite 4 ways. It was a gray kinda cloudy night. Any help what I might have saw? The date was January 10th, 2021. It was a cold night with a slight fog outside my hometown of Tunkhannock in northeast Pennsylvania. Many nights I like to take long walks in order to clear my mind from the busy day. I walked on the rural road by this large patch of woods not far from my home. On my right is an old building with 2 small wooden houses beside it. As I'm looking, I notice movement. Then I see an 8 to 10 foot pale white figure briskly walk across the road from one of the houses to the woods about 50 feet from me. I know I saw something, so I quickly continue forward. Whatever it was, I wanted nothing to do with it, and I now wanted to get home as fast as possible. A minute or 2 later, I look up. Again, I see this pale figure that is now on all 4s but still 5 feet tall at the shoulder. It is about 100 feet in the woods to the left of me. It had bleached white skin, a bald head, and huge black eyes. It had a human face and body, except it looked extremely emaciated and its arms were like super long. It started to sway its body back and forth like a mantis. This is when I ran as fast as I could. I only looked back after I ran for a solid 5 minutes, and I don't believe it had chased me. I was very close to home, and I was concerned that this pale humanoid was lurking about so near to where I lived. I have no idea what I saw, but I know that it was real, not an apparition. I know that you have written a book about these pale humanoids, and I wonder if this may be what you described as a crawler? Thanks. I have a story of a creature on my hunting land from when I was a kid. When I was about 10 years old, I was hunting with my grandfather, now deceased, on family-owned land near Covington, Minnesota. It was near dusk, and we've been sitting for a couple hours now. We haven't seen much, just a spiker and a small doe, nothing large enough to shoot. We were starting to lose hope and were getting ready to start the about 1-mile trek back to our cabin. As we were preparing to leave, we heard some twigs cracking from our right rear side. The stand we were in was tucked in the rear corner of a large clearing on one of the bigger trees in the tree line. As the cracks from the twigs got closer, I remember realizing that all other ambient noises stopped. When the creature finally emerged from the tree line, I remember my heart feeling like it stopped working and an overwhelming feeling of dread wash over me. What I saw was what looked to be a small buck that looked like it hadn't eaten in weeks and was an extremely pale brown, almost gray, with what looked to be a broken neck and a missing antler, stumble into the clearing. At this time the sun was just about to sink below the tree tops and cover the clearing with shadows. I recall looking over at my grandfather and seeing a level of fear I have never seen on his face before. Mind you, my grandfather was tough and fearless as they come, being he'd seen active duty in Vietnam as infantry. After seeing my grandfather's face, it just made the feeling in my stomach become worse. As we watched this deer stumble into the clearing, my grandfather reached for his binoculars. As he pulled them out, the lens cover made a small noise on the side of the stand. The creature must have heard it because it stopped its stumble, now in the middle of the clearing, and creepily rotated around and rose up on its hind legs and stared directly at us for about a minute before running off in an creepily awkward sprint into the woods. At this time it felt like I just had gotten the wind knocked out of me and I was petrified with fear. After the encounter, me and my grandfather sat in the stand completely silent, staring at the clearing, trying to make sense of what we just witnessed. As we started to walk back, we heard extremely weird, almost human-sounding noises coming from the woods around us. By the time we got back to the cabin, my grandfather decided it'd be best to call our trip early and head back home. But before we left, I had to use the bathroom, and our cabin was quite old, so I didn't have indoor plumbing, just an old outhouse. As I sat down to use the toilet, the immense feeling of dread returned as I heard human-like whispers and small scratches on the back of the outhouse. I screamed at the top of my lungs to my grandfather as I ran out of the outhouse crying. After that we drove back home and had a small discussion on what we saw. Despite being an avid hunter, that was my grandfather's last season of hunting, and about a year later we sold the land. I've told this story a couple times to close friends and family, but I think most of them think I'm crazy, especially being the only witness now that my grandfather passed away. Still to this day the encounter sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. Also, I was very tired when typing this, so please forgive me for any spelling errors. It was mid-November 2021 and me and about 10 friends were camping in the woods in the Sawtooth National Forest near Petite Lake. There were 2 groups of 4 people in 2 tents and 1 in a car, and me and my buddy were in hammocks near the edge of the camp. It's about 1 a.m. and we all had been sleeping for about 2 hours. I wake up to my hammock mate panting extremely heavily and yelling my name. I am confused and get up and help him. He is paralyzed by fear. He said that he had an extremely vivid dream that there was a black figure, tall and slender, trying to break into his car after he had seen this figure decapitate me and the rest of his friends. He said that he woke up to the figure near the car and saw all of our heads stuck on sticks throughout the camp. He proceeded, he said, to click the car alarm button, and the figure began to run circles around the car, and the stop then dashed off extremely quickly into the woods. I was obviously freaked out at this point and I immediately felt very uneasy. But I told him it was just a bad dream and that he needs to go back to sleep. Him and I tried for about 5 minutes, both stricken with fear at this point, when we hear our friend in the tent begin to yell, "No, no, don't take me." Side note, we had not awoken anyone else in the camp at this point. This freaked me and my buddy out quite a bit because we had no idea what was going on. We were also very vulnerable in our hammock by ourselves on the edge of our about 50-yard across camp. Our buddy's yells proceeded to wake up most of the rest of the camp. And we find out that our friend in the car that my buddy said clicked the car alarm of was awake. So all of us, scared and awake, have a conversation about what is going on, and the buddy in the car says that he heard scratching on the window and heard something pull the door. He also said that he had seen the black figure running around the car as well. We were all freaked at this point and decided to move into the same tent. Our friend with the dream also claimed a similar murder story to the friend in the hammock. The next morning we all talked, and so many of us experienced what happened that night, 6 in total, that we determined that it must have been some sort of being that was giving us nightmares. We called it a wendigo, but we have no idea. Also, we had friends that stayed at the same site about 6 months earlier, and a few of them did notice weird things happening at camp at night, like feelings of being watched or feeling of a being walking around their tent. Strange stuff in the Idaho mountains. What does this sound like, and what do you all think? This happened a couple months ago and I didn't think anything strange of it at the time, but after talking to multiple people including my father, I'm not very confident in what I saw anymore and I'm looking for some help. So I worked third shift at UPS, Richwood, Kentucky. I was driving a buddy of mine home a couple miles out, and had just started driving home. I was in the Beech Grove area near some apartment buildings on a back road. When about 30 to 40 feet in front of my car, I watched a creature dash across the road. I stopped my car to look at it. It stopped in someone's yard, turned back at me and made eye contact with me for about 10 seconds. I went to take a picture and it ran. At first I thought it was the first fox I had ever seen, but after some research online it looks nothing like foxes native to Kentucky. This fox was about 3.5 feet tall, very slender with long skinny legs. It didn't look malnourished though, it looked very healthy. Solid black eyes with pointy diagonal ears that were tipped black, with the lower half of its legs being black, and the tip of its tail being black. It was about 4 a.m. and pitch black outside, but there were plenty of porch and street lights for me to see it. It was also decently foggy that night. The only species of fox I've found online that looks like it is one that's native to Africa, and extinct. Since this encounter almost 2 years ago, I've seen 3 other wild foxes in the area. 2 were as described by Google, much smaller than the one I saw. The third one I saw was about 5 minutes out from my house and it looked just like the massive fox but slightly shorter. A friend of mine brought up the idea of it being a skinwalker, so I thought I'd post this here to get thoughts from anyone that would have any kind of idea for me, since I've heard stories of skinwalkers being in Kentucky. I live a suburban townhouse neighborhood in Pennsylvania with woods surrounding it. I hear screeches a lot during the summer and fall due to foxes. So it's not unnormal for me to hear them. But what's weird about this encounter is it's the middle of winter and foxes usually aren't out. I live in the basement of my house with a back door and light for outside. Tonight on January 8th just past 12 I heard a baby scream. Like I said, it's not uncommon due to the foxes, but this sounded like an actual baby. So I unlock my back door and turn on the light. I heard another screech, but this one was different, it sounded deeper. So like I usually do, I whistled. It responded with another screech. I'm still assuming it's a fox at this point, but I'm always interested to see if it could be something else. I whistled again, but it didn't make a screech. Instead I heard a whistle back. Now I'm a little freaked out at this point. I whistled again and it whistled back. After a couple more whistles and screeches I don't hear for a couple minutes, so I shut my back door, lock it and turn off the light. As I am currently writing this I hear it again and open my door and turn the light back on. Just a minute ago it sounded like PPL talking in the distance. I want to finish writing this before I listen again. So I need you guys' genuine opinion. What could this be? Is it a fox? Is it a skinwalker? Or is it a something else? It's currently 12:27 and I still hear the screeches. Let me know. So I want to first preface that I don't know much about skinwalkers and other creatures of similar nature. I recently started learning of their potential existence, so feel I'm willing to learn and be educated on the topic. There's this park my girlfriend and I go to smoke a lot, and we've encountered the same dog-like thing multiple times. It's always nighttime when we go. It looks like a really huge black dog with round bear-like ears and yellowish eyes. The first few times we saw it we didn't think much of it, but it kept just like spawning in. It never made a sound and always just stared at us and followed us around creepily. We've encountered it while high and while sober on multiple occasions that we stopped going to that park entirely. We would be walking from the parking lot to the park and we'll just see the thing emerge from behind a tree and follow us and try to block our path back to the car. We had to run and jump a fence just to get away from it once too. We've never had a single insanely creepy interaction, besides the time we were at the deepest corner of the park bordering a small forest and had to jump 2 fences to avoid the thing. I have a theory it could be a stray, but it really did not act like a dog at all. It didn't really even feel alive. It felt like it was just monitoring us for some reason, but it was really eerie. This happened around 2008 to 2009 and I am just now telling the story. I am 56 years old now. I have told 2 people about this. I was on Telegraph Road, heading south towards Toledo, Ohio. I had just picked up my brother in LaSalle, Michigan. He is 2 years younger than me. I was driving and he was in the passenger seat. We had just passed a horse farm and then there was a stretch of wooded area. Not thick woods, just quite a few trees. I was driving 55 miles per hour. Then something to the right of me caught my eye. I looked over to see my brother with a stunned look on his face staring out at this thing also. There was this thing in the woods, flying and keeping pace with us. My very first thought was it was a man with a jetpack flying. Then I realized it had wings. This thing was probably 7 to 8 feet long and had huge wings. It was black in color. It was almost racing us, it seemed. It then turned its head and looked at us. Big red eyes. My brother and looked at each other. We didn't say anything for a few seconds. One of us said, "Did you see that?" And we both said, "WTF was that?" We looked back over and it was gone. I slowed down a bit and we kept looking but didn't see it. Just today, I texted my brother and asked if he remembered this. He said yes, it haunts him and he doesn't tell anyone because they would call him crazy. That's how I feel. I have tried not thinking about it, telling myself it was a turkey vulture, it definitely was not, and other things. If my brother would have said no, I wouldn't be writing this. I am well respected in my community. I am an ordnance officer and my daughter is a sheriff's deputy. Thank you for letting me tell my story finally. It is quite a relief. I was hunting deer and bear with two buddies of mine. It was the second weekend out high Cascade deer season. We shot a bear just before dark and could not find it. The clear cut was very brushy and beginning to get very grown over. We decided to go to the pickup drive to the top of the hill 200 yards or so, pull over and back into a wide spot to spend the night. My buddies slept just behind my truck and I slept in the canopy with the tailgate and canopy door open. Sometime in the night near midnight, give or take an hour on either side, I was awakened by very loud footsteps. When I sat up to look outside, the moon was so bright one could read by it. I saw no one. This is a very remote area. We saw no campsites nearby, so I was surprised to hear someone walking down the road. I rolled over to see if the guys were still there. They were, and both asleep. The footsteps were loud and fast. I should have been able to see the person because it sounded so close. I then realized he had to be extremely heavy. I was about to roll over to sit up and look out again when it stopped. It had come around corner and saw the truck and stopped. I was afraid to move, so I just lay silently and listened. Then I heard light footfalls. It was sneaking up on us. It snuck up to the front of truck. Then I could hear it slowly work its way to the back. My head was out on the tailgate. If I tuned my head up and back I would have been able to see it, but I was too afraid to move. It then went back around the front of the truck and stopped for a few moments. I thought it would leave then. I knew this was not a four-legged animal. I've heard deer and elk as well as other animals on gravel roads, and this was defiantly bipedal. Now it began to snake down the other side of the truck to back and stand just above and behind me. This time I tried to look, but it was just too close, too far back to see without turning my head and body, and I was unwilling to do that. This time I could slightly hear it breathing. Then it sneaked back to the road, waited there for a minute or two, then loud and FST down the road it went. We were parked on a long curve, so when I finally looked out it had just gone out of sight. I was awakened when a deer came up to our spot, and it was very different. It snorted at us, then crashed down through the brush. The next day I asked the guys if Ty heard anything. They said they heard the deer. I didn't tell them about the footsteps. I looked for evidence but found nothing clear enough. We found the bear, packed it out, and I haven't gone back. I may have stumbled onto a print by pure accident, while hiking with my niece and nephew in the Chasselas National Forest, west of Dallas, Oregon. I will give details of the location later, as not to saturate the site with the public, so I can finish my investigation in the area and get more readings and data, GPS, photos, and history on the area. Here is what I have thus far. On the mid-afternoon of 24th of July, I took my niece age 13 and nephew age 16 to an area I used to hunt and log about 30 years ago west of Dallas, Oregon. 30 years has changed the area quite a bit, as Weyerhaeuser has bought up a lot of the land, Boise and Hampton Company, as most of the area is logged out. There is still a large standing area of some old growth and an area in which to hike in. We were not 15 minutes out from my truck on a trail, and my nephew blurted out, "Uncle Ron, look at this footprint." Off the trail a foot or two was a large print made in dried mud. The last rain in the area was about July 6, 2003, so the print was well defined and clear as the photo shows. Several things I noticed about the print. 1. It was not a boot print as no boot tracks were showing. The print was smooth, consistent with a barefoot print. 2. The width was about 9 inches wide at the largest width, and about 14 inches long. 3. Toe contours could clearly be seen, but it looks like whatever made a print may have stepped on a trig, wood, so not all the toes made an imprint in the mud, as the casting shows. 4. The footprint clearly shows a heel print, and arch in the foot, the edge of the foot at wide proportions from a very heavy individual. 5. As the trail is used lightly by mountain bikers and horses, as seen by tracks on the trail. Our 5 hours up on the trail, I only saw one mountain biker that day while in the area. So, it is not used that much, maybe only by locals who live in Dallas or people who know the area. I attempted to make GPS readings that day, but for some reason, my GPS could not pick up satellite signals, possibly from the heavy canopy of trees. Another attempt for a long/lot reading with negative results on a second trip. I will attempt a third trip with new batteries and see what happens. The print was, as I said, left of the trail, going SSW. I searched the area for about 2 hours, hair samples on trees, scat, or other prints in area. Negative results. Photos of area were taken from different perspective points. At this point, as I don't want to contaminate the area with undue traffic, I will keep the exact location confidential until I complete my investigation. Now a little history on the area. I have hunted the Falls City and Dallas area since 1970. In 1972, while heading to Falls City, Oregon, my friend Rick swerved to miss something darting across the road. I was a witness to something large, tall and running on 2 legs, not 4. Thinking it may have been a bear, or a crazed hunter dressed in black. We both, as teenagers, could not answer what we saw. The stories we had heard is, that the Dallas and Falls City area from old-timers, and hunter friends of ours, stories of Bigfoot circulated during that time. Especially after the famous Red Bluff, California film clip of the famous Roger Patterson from 1967. As the photo shows, I took a casting of the footprint. As mentioned, only one was found thus far. Within the next few days I will attempt to return to the area for further investigation and findings. We'll keep you posted. My wife's sister and their family had just moved into a new home in a new rural subdivision near Chevelin Park by Tamalo Creek in Bend. She had mentioned there were coyotes that made a horrible sounding noise sometimes at night. They opened their windows at night on the 2nd story level. Me and my family were spending the night there, and I awoke to hear a dreadful sounding repetitive call. Having grown up in the backwoods country of East Texas, I am familiar with the yapping cries of coyotes, and this sound was not from any animal I'm familiar with. The best way to describe the sound is that of a large bloodhound trying to clear its throat, whoa, loudly with no pitch or volume variances. It occurred in 2 separate periods, and the calls were about 5 or 6 repetitons, 2 seconds in length with about a 1-second gap in between them. Once the sounds ended, there was an eerie silence for about 5 or 6 minutes, even though there are several dogs in the neighborhood. On October 22, 2003, I was driving home with my younger brother and my friend. My brother was asleep in the back of my car, and my friend was sitting in the passenger seat next to me. We were driving along, and we always keep both eyes on the road. She spotted some eyes on the road, and called out, "Deer." I slowed down, because it's well known that deer are a bit crazy, and do jump out in front of cars. The thing about this experience was that it was quite odd. The animal was moving at an incredible speed, about the rate of a car going 5 to 10 miles per hour. We figured that if it was a deer, then it would be moving up and down, because they gallop, or jump, when moving at fast rates. This animal was moving at a steady rate, not moving up or down, There was also an odd smell in the air, much like a mix between rotting timber and dead animal. Another thing about the night was that it was decently lit by the moonlight. And I had my bright lights on. If it had been a deer or elk, I would have seen the light brown fur that they have, or a rack of antlers. None of these variables were present. Only a dark figure, and a set of eyes. I don't know what to make of this, but I thought coming here and asking for your guys' opinion on this would help because I'm honestly terrified. I'm not giving any names because I don't know if it was a skinwalker or not. I'll keep this as short as possible because I'm at work right now and don't have a lot of time. So 4 days ago I went to a bonfire with a couple of my coworkers. It wasn't huge, just a small get-together with about 7 people there. I knew everyone there, and for the first hour it was super fun. Now this place was out in the woods, barely got any reception. We were about a mile away from civilization, so if anything were to happen it would be pretty hard to get help. I live in Utah too, and there's not a lot of traffic around where I live so there wouldn't be many cars. There was only one person there I didn't know, but I just assumed he was one of my coworkers' friends so I didn't think anything of it. He was a tall skinny white dude, had black hair and blue eyes. Now I don't want to be that guy, but he was also pretty ugly. He was very distant, barely talked and kept to himself, which at first I didn't find odd. As this thing went along, I noticed he would stare at people for random every now and then, and this was when he felt a little off to me. Before asking anyone who he was, I started to observe him. His movements were very odd. I don't know how to explain, but the way he moved was very strange. He walked super strangly and moved his head and neck weirdly. This made me paranoid and ask all my coworkers if they know him. One by one I asked and each person said no, all saying they thought he was someone else's friends. This was it for me. Something told me to get out of there now. I went to all of my coworkers and told them everything and they all agreed to leave and go to another coworkers of mine home. We all packed our stuff up and loaded it into the car, acting like we were done for the night. He didn't get into any car, he just stood near the woods and waved goodbye. As we drove off, I was with my colleague and when we looked back, he was gone. It was an instant too, but that's not the only scary thing. My car window was recently broken so I didn't have a window up, so I could hear everything outside basically. On our way to my place, every now and then I would hear something that sounded like someone screaming, and I swear that one time someone called my name. This just made me super scared, and instead of joking about the situation, me and my friend were terrified. We kept hearing these noises, whines, a dog barking, a horse, someone screaming, people calling my name, and wolves howling. Something in me told me that something was making these noises to lure me into the woods, and luckily it didn't lure any of my friends into it. As we were leaving the gravel road and moving onto the main road, we looked back into the woods. I was behind all the other cars so I got a very good view of something, I don't know what, running way faster than any human should run across the gravel road. It was tall, skinny, and it looked really pale. I booked it at that point, driving past all of other coworkers' cars. My friend in the passenger seat asked what was wrong. I couldn't speak though. It was like I was so terrified I just wasn't paying attention. I just drove and I almost drove into the woods at one point. I only snapped out of it when one of my friends called asking what the hell was wrong and what happened. I lied and told him everything was fine. He didn't believe me though and kept pushing, but I kept lying. He eventually gave up and told me he would see me at my house. This made me terrified to go near any woods, and even scared to leave my house at some points. I'm terrified, and I think if my instincts wouldn't have kicked in and told me to leave, then I truly believe someone at that bonfire would have died. Took my research team up to Odell Lake for a trial run with them. Found several trees that have been twisted and snapped, fresh green, 9 feet area. Several logs been torn apart looking for termites no doubt, but no visible claw marks like a bear's. Heard young boyfriend calling for mama, I think, no more than 50 yards from us. Had newbies that got scared and left before mama kicked our butts. We'll be going down to a hunting area, Myrtle Beach area. My witness hunted there since child with grandpa, buddies, and him scared off by 4 individual screamers. One scream shook the car's windows. They left and never went back. Will report back if I find anything good. I want to preface this by saying I know what I saw wasn't a skinwalker, but this is the most helpful supernatural thread I've seen. I've scoured multiple places on the internet and I still haven't figured out what I saw. The door to my bathroom is at the end of my hallway, so there's no possible way someone could have walked by, looked in, and then walked away coming from the right of the door. Anyway, I was in the bath and all the lights were off save for the candle I had lit on the counter. I happened to look back down the hall, and in the right-hand corner a pale white, bald being looking at me. It had to be at least 9 feet tall because my ceiling is 8 feet, and it looked hunched over and was staring at me with its neck bent almost upside down. It looked kinda like Voldemort from Harry Potter, but tall and skinny. It was obviously gone when I looked back, but I haven't been able to figure out what it was. My partner suggested it was just a 9 feet tall ghost, but I don't think so. Any help or what direction to look in would be appreciated. I work night shift. 3 days ago I came home, took my shower, and was sitting on the couch. I had a box fan in the downstairs window blowing cold air in. I live by an old cemetery in a small village next to a national park. I first thought something was wrong when the cats in the house were panic walking back and forth by the wall that's facing the cemetery. I watched them for a minute and I heard what sounded like crying coming from the cemetery area and a soft "help me." I sat there and listened and heard it again a minute later. I quickly took the fan out of the window and closed and locked it and made everything else was locked. The past few days since then I've been feeling like I'm being watched. When I got home yesterday, my ears were ringing the loudest I've ever heard it, and I heard a soft sob again. I waited in my vehicle for 5 minutes, then walked to the door that's 10 feet away. When I was opening the door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, so I hurried up and closed the door behind me quickly and locked it. Once I was inside, the ringing immediately went away, but my cats were moving in a panicked manner again. I didn't know until recently that you aren't supposed to say the names out loud as it draws their attention, as does whistling at night. This is in Northeast Ohio. Thought? This is a very short story, but I really need to get it out there. I was driving through a narrow road at around 2 in the morning. This was after I finished my late shift as I work at a hospital, and a car crash happened and was in need of immediate surgery. Okay, now back to the road. This road was surrounded by trees and I was used to hearing crickets, but this time it was extremely quiet. My immediate thought was a skinwalker because I love spooky stories, but I told myself to stop being ridiculous as I was scaring myself. All of a sudden a terrible smell hit me and I closed all the windows to help with the smell what was before me. At this point alls I could think of was skinwalker, but I tried to make sense of this and accept it was probably a dead deer or moose creating the odor. This next part happens very fast, so be ready. As I was going down the road, a hunched wolf was sitting right in front of my headlight. My heart skipped 5 beats, then I remembered all the stories I read. One of my favorites was from Entropic Society and knew this was not a wolf because it was huge. Its legs looked like they were smashed by boulders and reattached. Its head snapped to me on one side and its head was tilted to its right. The thing what made me know is when it stared into my soul as it stood up to be 8 feet tall, its yellow eyes and its human hand slowly crept towards me. I drove to right into that thing and knocked it down barely, with gave me enough time to go through that tiny gap the giant monster left. As I made it through the gap, my wing mirrors collapsed in because of how narrow it was. Okay, this bit makes me tremble as I write it down. It started to run faster than my car. I tried to go full throttle, but from ramming into the skinwalker messed up my front part of the car. I was so close to the city I could see the street lights and a few drunkies beside trash. At the last moment it gripped onto the back of my car and its nails penetrated the roof of my ceiling. Now I was just leaving the forest when it jumped off and stared at me through the mirror inside of the car. I made it home and just didn't speak to my brother or my sister and went to sleep. The next morning I told this to my brother, who guaranteed I saw a skinwalker. This happened 4 months ago, and now I take a route which adds 20 minutes to my drive, but it's better than that cursed route. Last night I had a dream about a skinwalker. I know what a skinwalker is, what it looks like, and some of the legends and stories. I am native Alaskan and we have a similar story about the Kushtaka. But in this dream, I am certain it was a skinwalker. In the dream, I'm trying to put my almost 2-year-old daughter to sleep. The room is dark with a window on the opposite wall from where we are laying. The light switch is within arm's reach. My daughter is very restless and asking me to turn on the light. She's tossing and turning and crawling all over me, as toddlers do. But as the dream progresses, she's more and more insistent that I turn on the light. She begins to throw herself into a tantrum, so finally I turn on the light while still laying in bed. I immediately notice something outside the window, and there it is. Right outside the window, it had the face and fur of a coyote, but its legs were way too long. Its paws had long protruding claws and it was standing on its hind legs. In its mouth, and his front 2 claws, it held a half-eaten human baby. I began to screaming in the dream and woke up screaming as well. When I opened my eyes and began to wake up, I couldn't move my body for several minutes. The reason why I think this could be a bad omen, or even a death omen, is because I am 10 weeks pregnant. The pregnancy is going well so far, but I have never had a dream that has been that vivid or that has scared me that much. I feel that it was a very clear message. But I would like some other opinions. What does it mean? Very early morning, woke up to a loud walking noise in the gravel outside my house. I looked towards the window and noticed that the sensor light turned on. I walked up to the window and I looked out and saw a large shadowy figure walking across the road. It looked to be around 6 or 7 feet in height. Later the next morning I heard branches falling. It was terrifying, because as I heard the branches falling I heard this high-pitched squeal that was very frightening. It also appeared as if there were more than one of these creatures. My sister and I were on our way to Calumet Falls. We were just on the west side of Oak Ridge on Highway 97, and all of a sudden 2 cars in front of us stop, and this large, hairy thing over 7 feet tall lumbered on hind legs across the highway. From the north side to the south side. It was moving quite quickly and disappeared into the woods of the south side of the road. I used to work on Vandenberg Air Force Base in Central California. My office was on top of the mountain that was ceremonial Chumash land. Whenever ground was broken, we had to have a religious leader come out and bless the ground first. It's usually pretty foggy about halfway up the mountain, and I got used to driving it every day, but you have to keep an eye out for deer, mountain lions, bears, all sorts of wildlife. One night at about 11 p.m. I was driving down the mountain and had just gotten to the point that the fog was gone. In front of me was clear and behind was just a wall of fog. As I got to a sharp turn I saw what I thought was a large coyote in the road, so I slammed on my brakes. It looked like it had no fur and was covered in pale leathery skin with a dog-like head. As I looked at it, it rose up on its hind legs. It was hunched over at maybe 6 feet tall, but if it was standing straight I'd guess 7 feet. It turned and looked right at me and slowly walked off the road into the brush. At the time I was doing a class about Native Americans for my degree and was in touch with Chumash members for my project. I asked them if they knew anything about it and they simply said we don't talk about that. To this day I'm 100% sure I saw a skinwalker that night. My friend first came across the prints while walking through the sage hunting rabbits. It's a high desert area with no visible trees for miles. It is 15 plus miles to nearest residence, which is the Simplot cattle ranch. We observed several large tracks made by one creature. The track had a very large big toe and 3 other toes on each foot. We did not backtrack but followed the prints for several yards. We then went back to hunting. The tracks continued on. So this happened last year, and almost every year I go to Palatka and go to a place called the Badlands. It's a giant tree farm that his family owns, but in general it's in the woods. So one day we were hanging at the angel tree, which is just a nice giant beautiful tree, and we heard a turkey because it's the wild. So my friend Andrew made the joke of saying how you never know when you'll have to shank a turkey. Either way, we went to go check it out. After we got like 5 feet onto the trail, the noises from the turkey stop. Then I hear to my left while Andrew heard it to his right. We hear footstep. Now of course you could have said how there's deer and other wildlife, which there is, but it sounded like human footsteps, like the distinct noise of bare feet? That's what it sounded like. The second we heard that, we ran to the ATV and went back to the house. I looked up if there is Navajo grounds in Florida, and I kind of found something, I think, but the articles were all over the place. Ever since then we haven't heard it again since, but we don't feel that safe going out in those woods anymore, especially at night. Now again, I know this is a skinwalker subreddit, but I don't know if this was a skinwalker or a Wendigo or anything at all. I wanted to share something I experienced in 2018 which, after reading some of the descriptions here, made me think posting would be a good idea. Maybe someone can comment on whether this fits the profile or not. This happened in Urbana, Illinois during spring 2018 around 8 p.m. I was driving an SUV through a residential area, 30 miles per hour, with moderate street lighting. I was coming back home from grocery shopping and turned a corner into the usual street. After driving 1 block, I saw something similar to a large, white silver dog figure suddenly run towards the right front wheel of my vehicle. I gauged its size to be substantially larger than that of a German Shepherd, with an unusually bright hide. I braked quickly in fear of having run over it. Within seconds, I got off the car and performed a quick check. No signs of any injured animal, no nearby rustling into an unkempt garden next to where it all happened, no animal crossing the road. This took less than 5 seconds. Then I paused and saw the same figure 2 blocks away from where I was, looking at me intensely for about 30 seconds. I looked back to the tire in my vehicle an instant, and it was suddenly gone when I checked again. All happened in less than a minute. After this, I drove around several blocks without signs of any dog or similar animal nearby for about 10 minutes. Estimating the distance and time between events, I am certain that it is not feasible for a dog, much less such a large one, to run that quickly that distance, particularly without seeing it under street lighting. Comments are welcome. Alright, so let me first begin by telling my place. I am from northeast of India, very quiet and lovely, full of nature and very distant from the eccentric part of India. And the creature in my story is called Kiimbu Kaoiba. In my tribe's language it means half man, half tiger, or like man, like tiger, to be precise. Quite similar to the skinwalker, eh? Anyway, my tribe is actually the Meitei tribe of the state of Manipur. There are several states in the northeastern India, with multiple tribes in each state. They might or might not have this mythological creature in their folklore, but this story is one of the famous one in our tribe among others. The exact famous one is about the story about this creature, Kiimbu Kaoiba, with the 7 brothers and 1 sister. If you guys want to hear this story, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to share the story or in fact share you an animated YouTube video about the said story, some guy from our state created. It's exactly how it has been told to us when we were kids. And it's very eerily similar to the Navajo legend, although the creature in our story is just one guy/creature instead multiple creatures who was a famous medicine man or Ojah who discovered he could conjure some dark magic to convert himself to a tiger or this vile animal and could convert back to his human form. Also I've heard, I don't know if it's true, but people in Thailand, Myanmar and few other Southeast Asian countries apparently knows about this story but in their own different twist. But it does make sense. 'Cause in our story it ends with the creature running away/chased away to the south of our state, and it's quite likely it found a new home in those countries. But now that I know that skinwalkers in the West existed or exists, well debatable by most I guess, I think my story now gives a whole new perspective to its existence and its widespread activity it had around the world. Or it's a common dark magic among the planets which and witches world. When I was around 10 or 12, roughly 12 years ago, me and my grandma and uncle went to Jasper in Canada. Given how I was born in Canada itself, nothing weirded me out when it came to the woods and nature as a whole. I've seen and heard deer before and a whole slew of animals. I don't remember much from the trip other than a bits and pieces, but what I do remember was arriving at the hotel and climbing up the steps to the second floor. The hotel had a parking lot in front before the road. I remember waking up one morning in the hotel while my grandma and uncle were still asleep and walking over to the window to peer out from behind the blinds to see a fox standing in the middle of a road. It looked like it had been run over given how oddly it was shaped. Concerned for its safety, I wanted to wake up my grandma or simply run out there to check on it. I felt my stomach sink when it turned to face at me. Its head looked bruised and misshapen, which I would have ruled out as it having been run over had it not stood on its hind legs. I turned my head away from the window and yelled for my grandma to wake up, who slept in her bed just a couple feet away before I looked back and saw it walk on those hind legs to the side where the building hid my view from the rest of the road. I looked completely insane when my grandma moved me aside and saw nothing on the road, even going as far as to open the door and peer down both ends of the walkway. Nothing. Regardless, I can say with confidence I'm not going back to Jasper. When I was about 10, my family wanted to drive cross-country through the Southwest, visiting places throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. We stopped for the night at a cheap cabin. I don't remember the exact location, but I remember it being somewhere between Alamogordo and Roswell. The area around it was very densely wooded, and it was about 20 minutes from a small gas station where we got food for the night. It was a 2-bedroom cabin with a living room, and my parents took the big room. My younger sister got the other bedroom, and I was on the pull-out couch. The couch was placed directly next to a large window, looking out at a creek leading into the woods. Day went by, and everyone went to sleep. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a knocking on the window. I was facing away from it, and was too scared shitless to turn around. It wasn't a random knocking either. It was rhythmic, like a waltz with long pauses. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Too terrified to move, I lied there, trying not to make noise, until whatever was out there started to make a quiet, shrill, high-pitched whistle. When I heard that, I started screaming for my father, and the knocking abruptly stopped, and my dad ran into the room. He's not a superstitious man, and says to this day that he didn't see anything, but according to him, the sense of malaise that hit him was unlike anything he ever felt before. He got my sister, and we all slept together in the big bedroom. The next day, I looked at the ground outside the window, and saw large deer tracks leading directly up to it. We have did similar trips until I moved out, but my dad refused to go back to that area. So this is a story from my brother, As such, I have no way of validating that this happened at all except one part that I'll get to later. So back in 2015 my brother worked for a security guard hiring place, not exactly sure what to call it. Basically he'd call and they'd station him some place or another that needed it. So this particular time my brother got hired by the local cemetery. They'd had issues with kids sneaking in at night and messing things up, and at one point, they even broke a couple graves. Anyways, his job was just to drive around the cemetery and make sure no one was messing around. This area was pretty rural and at the time, had a pretty bad stray dog problem. Dogs would get lost or people would drop them and they'd form packs and roam the countryside. On this particular night, my brother was at the cemetery and noticed a pretty big pack of dogs, about 8 or so, just wandering around and playing. There was a big Rottweiler, important later, a couple of mixed breed dogs, and even a little Bichon Frise that was clearly someone's pet at some point because it still had a harness on. Also important later. So my brother is doing his rounds, which, like I said, was basically to drive from one end of the cemetery to the other with a spotlight and make sure no kids were breaking things or banging in one of the mausoleums or something. He's driving real slow and has the window down, his arm out the window with the spotlight, and it's pitch black at this point. Suddenly he hears the dogs going crazy, and then he hears what he best described as a sound that sounded like that screaming bird from the swamp episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon, but deeper and more human, with a rattling sound mixed in, kind like a rattlesnake's rattle. The dogs go silent before starting back up barking and snarling a few minutes later. Then something fast and pale runs in front of his headlights with the 8 dogs in pursuit, barking and snarling. So he decides to follow the dogs in fear that they're getting ready to tear someone's pet to pieces. He parks his car, gets out with his spotlight, then follows the sound of barking before he hears that scream again and swears that he heard a faint hail mixed in with the weird screech and rattling. He gets to where the dogs are going nuts and shines his light at the spot and is surprised to see that the dogs have a deer backed up against the wall of a mausoleum. He said that this deer was a pale gray color, it was skinny and emaciated, and then he shines the light on its eyes. They're black, he says, but no light reflects from them and no shine either. They look like the eyes of something dead. He is understandably confused, and he's standing there, a few yards away from a pack of angry, snarling dogs that haven't even registered that he's there. The dogs have this deer surrounded and are taking turn nipping at his hind end and legs, but my brother notices that every time they do, they recoil and sort of gag, as if the taste is appalling to them. My brother then hears a deep growling from behind him, and this big Rottweiler bowls past him, launches itself at this deer, grabs its hind leg, and with a mighty shake, knocks the thing over and just starts wailing on it. And then he says the deer lets out that screech again. It then takes its hoof and swipes, yes, he said swipes, at the dog lets go and the thing takes off, dog's hard on its heels. He never did guard work at that cemetery again, but he did go back a few days later and managed to get the little Bichon Frise to come to him. He's had that dog for the last 5 years. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for daily stories. We at Horror Den of Misfits really enjoy this, and your support would be appreciated.